Macmillan Digital Audio and Belinda present this unabridged recording of
The Promise by Lucy Diamond, read by Catherine Stewart. Prologue. It was almost midnight, and the Thames was rolling along, black as tar, wrinkling and smoothing itself beneath the starlit sky. The houseboats were shadowy shapes at their moorings as frost scattered icy glitter across rooftops and railings, silvering each trembling blade of grass. High above, a crescent moon gleamed, as lustrous as wedding satin. A man walked unsteadily down the river path, hands shoved in his pockets, head bowed. His world seemed to have tilted on its axis, and he wasn't sure how to right himself again. First, there had been the breathless phone call that afternoon. "I've got something to tell you," leaving him with the prickling sense that luck was slipping between his fingers, that maybe the charm he'd always relied upon might not be enough to rescue him this time. Then, feeling cornered, he had lashed out needlessly, hurting people he loved with his words. Now he was left with a rising tide of dread that he couldn't shake off. What was he going to do? Had he blown everything? A scouring wind skimmed off the river against his face, and somewhere in the distance a fox shrieked, as high-pitched and unnerving as a child's scream. The man hunched deeper into the collar of his coat, wishing he was already at home, the front door bolted, warm and safe in bed, the heating pipes cooling with their soft clicks and creaks. But did he even deserve to be there anymore, after what he had done? Suddenly there were footsteps scuffling behind him. A shout. "Oi, mate!" He turned, and then... Chapter 1. It wasn't as if Dan had been deliberately avoiding Zoe since the funeral. All the same, when he glimpsed her and Bea at the far end of the supermarket aisle, his first thought was to swerve away and hide. Sweat prickled between his shoulder blades. Adrenaline spiked in jags through his blood. Every instinct he possessed told him to get out of there. Fast. Run. But then he pictured himself fleeing like a criminal, hunched low in the driver's seat of his car, and knew he would feel even more of a scumbag than usual, which was saying something. Lurking behind an end-of-aisle stationery display, he felt a wrench inside as his gaze fell on Bea. She was wearing a grubby unicorn onesie, with the rainbow-striped horn at a dejected angle on the hood, trailing after Zoe, who was pushing the trolley. Were those tears streaking his niece's round face? Yes, he thought, they were. Bea was usually a happy-go-lucky resident of her own magical daydream world. Dan remembered her on her 6th birthday blowing out the candles on her cake and saying that she wished she could be a real unicorn when she grew up. Beatrice Rose Shepherd had always been everybody's poppet, the apple of her daddy's eye, all dimples and bouncing. Although not today, clearly. "Come on, Dan. Stop being a coward. Say hello at the very least," he ordered himself. He hurried to catch up with them. "Zoe, hi." Shame stabbed him below the ribcage as he noticed how thin and pale she appeared, how far away her gaze. There had always been a wholesome sheen about Zoe, with her golden hair and rosy cheeks, but today she bore the dull skin and deadened expression of someone who'd just clawed her way through the worst weeks of her life. "Hello, Bea," Dan added weakly when Zoe didn't answer immediately. "Hello," muttered Bea, eyes damp. Then her lower lip slid out, pink and quivering, as she stamped a foot back in argument mode. "But why not, Mummy?" she pouted. Ignoring her, Zoe gave Dan an unfriendly look. "I thought you were meant to be in South America," was all she said. Dan hung his head. Didn't go, he replied. Obviously. His suitcase was still half-packed on the bedroom floor, where he hadn't been able to face putting away the neat piles of new shorts, t-shirts and hiking socks, although he had at least managed to claim back most of the money from the untaken flights. It seemed like a dream now, that whole itinerary he and Tiggy had discussed and planned. The mountains he'd intended to climb, the temples and jungle and beaches he thought they'd be visiting, the fiestas and full moon parties she had been so excited about. Dan's great adventure to show the world there was more to his life than spreadsheets and calculations. Typical, he hadn't even made it as far as the airport, though. Having arranged 3 months off work, he had barely been anywhere, other than the coroner's court, the crematorium, and his own miserable flat. He swallowed, aware of the awkward pause that was building between him and his sister-in-law. So, how are you both doing? Stupid, stupid question. Stupid, stupid man. How were they doing? It was 3 weeks since Patrick had died. They were probably doing about as abysmally as Dan, worse, if anything. He'd last seen them at the funeral, after which he had borne both Zoe's gaze avoiding reproach. This happened on your watch. And the louder, shriller version from his mum. I don't understand. Why did you let Patrick go off like that? Over a stupid argument. Honestly, Daniel. He had ended up repeating, sorry, and he went before I could stop him, on a miserable kind of loop, before resorting to desperate self-defense. Look, you know what Patrick was like. He was totally out of order, all right? I was angry. Except that this had been greeted by the pursed lips and judgmental head shaking that was somehow worse than any yelled accusations. Yes, and now he's dead, his mum's silence said. Dead. And you're the one to blame. Oh, you know, Zoe replied, voice flat. Limping along. Bee, stop there now, come on, she added, when the little girl showed no signs of ending her grizzling. But I want it, whined Bee, leaning against a rack of magazines. There was one with 3 plastic fairy wings attached that she kept plucking. I want it, Mummy, very badly. Please. No, snapped Zoe. I've said no, and that's that. Get your hands off it before you crease the pages. You're not having it. Enough. Bee slumped against the trolley as if she'd been shot. It's not fair, she howled, fresh tears springing from her eyes. You're so mean to me. I hate you. You could practically hear Zoe's teeth grinding as she tried to hang on to her patience. I said, enough. Her knuckles were white against the trolley handle, her face tightening as an elderly woman walked past and made a disapproving tut. And I mean it. Any more, and I'll get cross. Dan opened his mouth. He wanted to say, I'm sorry. He wanted to say, I know this is all my fault. He wanted to say, let me finish that shopping for you. Let me do something to help. I'll buy that magazine for Bee. I'll buy all of them. I don't mind. How are the boys? He asked instead. Bee was now kicking the trolley mutinously, a pink light flashing on her scruffy white trainer with every kick, a cross-defiant unicorn with a flushed face and blazing eyes. They're fine, Zoe said, but in a beaten-down voice that meant they were not fine. Well, of course they weren't fine. Anyway, she went on, shrugging, I'd better go. I need to pick Gabe up from his football club in... She glanced at her watch. Christ, in 25 minutes, actually. I should crack on. Sorry, she added as a harassed-looking man tried to squeeze past them with a full trolley. Get out the way, Bee. Right, Dan replied, clearing his throat, wanting to say more, to say anything that might build a bridge between them, or at least begin papering over the crevasse. Maybe... But she was already walking away, calling bye in a stiff, sod-off sort of voice over one narrow shoulder, the wheels of the trolley squeaking in protest as she swung it into the next aisle. Dan stood there, clutching the wire supermarket basket, remembering the first time he had ever met Zoe. How he and Patrick had been in the Ram, not realising that some god-awful karaoke evening was about to begin. Jesus, let's get out of here, Patrick had groaned when the opening chords to Atomic started up, and they saw the three women clustered expectantly around a microphone. But then his face changed as he looked again. "Check out that blonde one," he said, eyes glued to her, and they'd both fallen silent as she gave it her best Debbie Harry. She was taller than her friends, and slender in tight jeans and boots, with long yellow hair that swung around her shoulders as she moved, and an animated face that you couldn't help but warm to. "I'm in love," Patrick said, as the song ended and there was a ragged round of applause. Then he added, "I'm going to marry that woman," and got up, making it to the bar just before she did. "Allow me to buy you a drink, Miss Harry," Dan heard him say. "Or can I call you Debbie?" The rest, as they said, was history. She'd always been fun, Zoe, that was the thing. Originally from South Wales, she was giggly, kind, and gorgeous. Dan had secretly fancied her himself until he grudgingly had to admit that she and his brother made the perfect couple. "Patrick Shepherd has been tamed at last," their mates teased, all raised eyebrows and disbelief. Who'd have thought? More than tamed, though. Patrick had met his match. "She makes me want to be a better man," he confessed to Dan after a few pints early on in the relationship. "To try harder. To be good. Do you know what I mean?" Dan knew exactly what he meant. Because Zoe herself was good through and through, smiling and golden, a person who shone her attention on you like a lamp and made you feel warm in the glow. She listened properly, remembering tiny threads of conversation and then restringing them the next time you met. "Did you get that commission you were hoping for? How's Rebecca's dad? What was the film like? Is it worth seeing?" Once, just after Dan had split up with Rebecca, Zoe had paid a surprise visit, only to find him blind drunk and unshaven with the curtains pulled at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He'd been embarrassed to see her looking so pretty and clean in his grungy living room, and half expected her to start flinging wide the curtains and forcing coffee down his throat. Instead, she'd cracked open a beer with him, slouched companionably into the sofa and said, "Go on then, tell me all about it." He'd ended up feeling a fraction better about everything as they talked, as if one person in the world might understand after all. But today she looked terrible. Her radiant face seemed to have caved in, all the sparkle bleached away, her shoulders drooping with an unbearable weariness. He had done that to her, he thought. He had done that. The guilt was so monstrous that he had to lean against the nearby rack of greeting cards because he suddenly felt unsteady, as if the ground was shifting beneath him. He dropped the wire basket to the floor with a metallic clatter and left the supermarket, smarting with shame. Driving home, Dan felt detached from the world, which probably wasn't recommended in the highway code. This was how life had become since the accident, though. Observing time passing like an outsider, the days and weeks dragging by in a sludgy sort of numbness where nothing touched him. Having haltingly explained to Tiggy that he could no longer join her on the South America jaunt, he spent most of the time in bed like an invalid, unable to manage anything much besides sleep or staring at the walls. Well-meaning people kept assuring him that time was a great healer, But as February turned into March and early blossom began appearing on the trees, Dan couldn't say that he had noticed any meaningful personal change. The shock of his brother's death still throbbed like an aching wound, hot with infection, the horror as fresh and new as ever. He missed Patrick so much, and yet the missing him was tangled up and tainted with the last evening they'd spent together, with how it had all ended. If he shut his eyes at any moment, day or night, Dan would find himself back there, walking home alone with the lampposts casting their cones of orange light through the darkness, the sound of bassy reggae from a passing car rising and falling, the smell of frying onions and spicy meat from the kebab shop on the corner. The night air was cold against his face, in contrast to the alcohol and rage boiling his blood, and his fists were still clenched. How he'd hated his brother in those last few minutes, truly hated him. And yet how he wished now that someone could have told him, warned him, "You're making a huge mistake, one you will always regret. Turn round, go back, patch things up. Otherwise you'll never see him again." There had been no such warning, no such premonition, though. Instead, he had continued home, alone and seething, while fate had been left to play its cruel trick. And now they all had to live with the consequences. He hadn't cried properly yet, not even at the funeral. Sure, his throat felt tight for a while, especially at the sight of Zoe and his mum breaking down in tears, hands over their faces. But that was it. A rock of sadness had appeared inside him instead. The burden of having been the last person in the family to see Patrick alive, plus the solid ache of his loss. "Thick as thieves, you two," his mum had often said fondly during their childhood, ruffling their hair, or sometimes rolling her eyes with frustration if they were trying her patience. He was an only child now, though. Arriving home, Dan sank to the floor in his hallway, breathing in the stale air that told tales of too many takeaway dinners. He remembered with a pang the fixed set of Zoe's jaw, the numb exhaustion scored into her face, and felt ashamed. Patrick's death had dropped a huge and terrible crater into her life, and yet there she was, limping along, as she put it, filling a supermarket trolley with food for the kids, while Gabe was at football, and Ethan was presumably taken care of elsewhere. Meanwhile, here was Dan, with no kids and very few responsibilities. Did the spider plant count? Probably not. Wallowing in self-pity as if he was the only one affected by his brother's death. Some days he hadn't even got dressed or left his bed. Had Zoe been afforded that luxury? Of course she hadn't. How would Patrick have reacted in a similar situation, he wondered, if, for instance, a mate of his had died suddenly, leaving a wife and kids behind, shell-shocked and struggling? If Patrick had come across them in the supermarket, the child weeping, the mother defeated-looking, he'd have scooped them up in the next instant. Dan knew it. He would have hoisted the tearful child onto his shoulders, come to the rescue, taken charge. "Okay, I'm here now. I'll help you," he'd have said, in that direct way of his, before leaping into action and heroically saving the day. Whereas Dan, well, he'd done nothing. He'd scurried from the building, having provided no support or solace whatsoever. What a loser, he chastised himself. What a selfish coward. He found himself thinking about the occasions when he'd been round at his brother's place, having arrived before Patrick got back from work, how the whole house became charged up with new energy and noise the moment Patrick let himself in with a bellow of, "I'm home!" The younger kids would swarm all over him like monkeys, shrieking with laughter, Zoe's face lighting up as he came to kiss her. How quiet the house must be now, without him. How empty it must feel. And yet Dan hadn't been round there once since the accident. He had bottled picking up the phone or sending a text because he didn't know what to say. What kind of a brother-in-law did that make him? What kind of uncle? It was shoddy of him. Really shoddy. Suddenly he was sick of feeling sorry for himself, sick of doing nothing. He got to his feet again, grabbing his bike helmet and keys. Patrick's death had broken Zoe and the kids. What sort of man was he if he didn't at least attempt to put things right? "Oh," said Zoe, with a distinct lack of enthusiasm when she opened the door and saw him there. "Hello. Twice in one day." She was wiping her hands on a grey and white striped tea towel, and it was only then that Dan realised, too late, that it must be getting on for 5:30 and she was probably busy making dinner. Of all the things he had pondered on, cycling along the river path to Kew, this one had not occurred to him. Good start, Dan, he thought with a sigh. "Hi," he said. She was still unsmiling, he noticed in dismay. "Okay if I come in? Just thought I'd..." He trailed off, embarrassed. "Just thought I'd pop round and see how you all are," he'd been about to say. But the words sounded trite, when it had taken him this long to bother. "Thought I'd say hi," he said weakly instead. Again. She lifted a shoulder, her mouth a flat line, as if she didn't especially care what he did, but held the door wider for him nevertheless. "Thanks," he said, lugging his bike up the steps. Taking care not to leave an oily mark as he leaned it against the cream-coloured wall, he found his eye falling on a framed photograph hanging nearby, of Patrick and Zoe signing the register on their wedding day. There was Patrick in his best charcoal grey suit, a white carnation in the buttonhole, his thick dark hair neatly cropped. His face was tilted as he gazed at Zoe with such love, such adoration, it burned Dan's eyes to see it. To have and to hold, till death do us part. Oh, Patrick, he thought, suddenly desolate again. How was it possible that his brother was no longer present, wandering through to slap Dan on the back and offer him a beer? "All right, mate." "Yeah, not bad. You?" "Sorry," he said, realising he was standing there in silent mourning. He'd been right about the quietness of the house, he thought. The atmosphere was like a held breath, a suppressed sob. Yeah, so I thought, can we talk?" "Sure," she said, unmoving. She did hate him. She didn't even want him to go any further into the house. "Could we..." The words stuck in his throat. Patrick and Zoe had always been the most generous hosts, pressing food and drink on you, urging you to stay. "There's no rush, sit down, help yourself." But today, resentment radiated from her in waves. Go away," her body language said. "You should have stopped him. He'd still be here, alive, if it wasn't for you." Dan forced himself to finish his sentence. "Maybe go in the kitchen?" "Okay." She turned and walked down the hall into the large light-filled kitchen. He remembered them having this extension built, back when Gabe had just been born. How the flapping sheets of blue plastic over the end of the wall had frightened Ethan, who must have been 4 at the time. This room was the heart of the home. The long oak table set more often than not with a couple of extra places for friends. The layers and texture of family life that had silted up were visible everywhere. Framed holiday photos and Art Deco posters alongside the crayoned drawings on the walls. A collection of spotted mugs clustered colourfully along the dresser, mingling with various wonky school-made pots. the fridge boasting certificates for good spelling, football skills, and art commendation. Today, the room had a different feel. Perhaps it was the meanness of the late afternoon light that left it drabber than usual, but there was definitely a new air of neglect about the place as well. Some of the plants on the windowsill appeared shriveled and stalky, their leaves miserably brown in places. There was a box of recycling by the bin, cardboard and empty yogurt pots and tin cans, waiting to be sorted. And random stuff lay everywhere. Library books, an unopened post, a pair of shin pads, a roll of gaffer tape, a broken necklace, a spelling chart. A Lego knight lay face down on top of the butter dish, and Dan stood it up again, wondering where the children were. It felt as if he'd entered an alternative universe, one out of sync with real life. "Sorry about the mess," Zoe said. She sounded defiant, as if she expected criticism. "I'm in the middle of dinner." "Yes, sorry," he replied like an echo, unsure what else to say. There were sausages spitting in formation under the grill, he saw, a pan of potatoes foaming on the hob, and a chopping board on the side with a mound of peeled carrots. "Can I do anything?" He hadn't even brought a token gift, he realised, cursing himself. No flowers or wine, no peace offering at all. "It's fine," she said. "Do you want a drink? I'm going to carry on with this, if you don't mind." Not at all," he replied. He couldn't bring himself to say yes to a drink, despite the dryness of his mouth. He couldn't take anything else from her. So, he began. He broke off, trying to remember the speech he'd composed on his way here. It had seemed plausible back then, noble even, but now the right words seemed to have slid out of reach. "I came round to say that I'm sorry I've not been over for ages, but I do want to help," he managed to get out. "I'm sad too," he wanted to say. "I've been a complete mess. Today is the first time I've shaved in a fortnight. I want to support you and the kids," he went on. "You know, be there for you all. So, if there's ever anything I can do, then—" "Mummy! He hit me!" yelled Bea just then, bursting into the room like a small raging tornado. "Gabe hit me with the remote, right here." Bristling with self-righteousness, she pointed to her temple, where a red mark bloomed. "See?" Zoe's shoulders stiffened. "Gabe," she shouted tonelessly, "what have I told you? If you can't share, the screen goes off. Do you hear me?" "You said he'd be banned from the Xbox if he did it again," Bea was keen to remind her. "You need to ban him now, Mummy. Tell him." "I'm busy at the moment," Zoe said, not turning round as she chopped through another carrot. "Hi, Bea," said Dan. This was his chance to do something useful, he realised. "Shall we set the table together to help Mummy?" "That's Ethan's job," she said, flouncing out again. "Gabe, Mummy says you're in big trouble," they heard her yell. "Really, really big. If you touch me again, you're dead." Zoe flinched at her daughter's words, but before Dan could say anything, Ethan walked into the room. "What's for dinner?" he asked. "Oh, hi, Uncle Dan." Ethan was tall and reedy, pale-faced with large square glasses and tufty ginger-brown hair. He was a quiet boy, thoughtful and artistic, who gave the impression of creating whole worlds up in his unwalled mind. He'd been such an earnest toddler, head always cocked as he asked one brain-bending question after another. Now he was 14 and still a quirky sort. Patrick had worried about him starting secondary school. He's not like the other kids. They'll kick the shit out of him, he'd agonised once to Dan. But so far, Ethan seemed to be surviving unscathed. Bangers and mash, Zoe said shortly. Hi, mate, said Dan. How's school? Then he promptly cringed at his own remarks because, 1, Ethan was not a mate kind of person, and 2, no kid ever liked being asked, how's school? The most boring question in the world. Are you working on a new sculpture at the moment? He added quickly, as if needing to prove that he had actually met his nephew before. Nope. I've stopped going to the club. Ethan grabbed some cutlery from a drawer and began dumping it around the table. Oh, that's a shame, said Dan, straightening a fork. He vaguely remembered that Ethan had been overjoyed to be offered a place there, some edgy creative space in Wandsworth where they made all sorts of weird and wonderful artworks from wire and scrap metal and clay. How come? I don't think we need to go over this again, Zoe said, sweeping the chopped carrots into a pan of boiling water. A muscle clenched in Ethan's jaw, and he banged down the last knife with such force that it spun in a circle. Then he stormed out of the room. Good one, Zoe muttered, rolling her eyes. Sorry, Dan said for what felt like the 100th time since he'd arrived. I didn't realise. Zoe swung round, eyes glittering. No, Dan, you didn't, did you? You didn't realise because you've no idea what's been going on. She slammed a lid on the pan of carrots and the blue flame beneath it jerked and trembled in response. Coming round here and bleating sorry over and over again like that's going to change anything. Well, it's not good enough. You're too late. Sorry, he said before he could stop himself, then grimaced. But look, I do want to help, No, you look, she said, folding her arms across her chest. But then Bea was barrelling into the room once more, wailing this time. He twisted my arm right behind my back. It hurts. I think it's broken. Zoe became rigid, as if she was on the verge of shattering into pieces. You want to help? She asked Dan, so fiercely it felt like an attack. You really want to help? Yes, of course, he said. She was going to ask him to have a word with Gabe, he guessed, or pour glasses of water to go with dinner, or come back tomorrow and run the lawnmower around the garden, which was looking pretty unkempt. Great, she said, her voice clipped. She held her hands up in the air, signalling surrender. Then it's all yours, she said. Dinner, the kids, everything. I'm going out. What? Where? Dan asked in surprise, but Zoe was already striding towards the door. Mummy! Screamed Bea, racing after her. Don't go! Come back! What the hell? Asked Ethan, as first his mother and then his sister charged past him. In the hall, Bea had body-slammed Zoe and was now clinging around her legs. Mummy, no! She cried. Don't leave me! Stop being so dramatic, Zoe said, stuffing some keys in her jeans pocket. I'm not going forever. I just need a break. She unwound the little girl's arms from her knees. Be good for your uncle, she added on her way out. Mummy! Bea howled as the front door closed. Through the red and green teardrop shapes of its stained glass window, you could see Zoe walking quickly down the path, then turning onto the pavement. Dan blinked and she was gone completely. Meanwhile, Bea was rolling around on the carpet, wailing and snotty. She had lost one parent already, Dan remembered. He had to be kind with her, rather than impatient. It's all right, he said, kneeling down. He put a wary hand on her shoulder, as if she were a wild animal, but she shook him off with a sob. Mummy'll be back soon. She's just gone for a walk. Do you want to help me dish up tea? No, I just want her. She's not allowed to dish up, Ethan put in unhelpfully. Too babyish. She'd only spill something or burn herself. Would not. Lying face down, Bea kicked out, almost scoring a direct hit to Dan's groin. Hey, he yelped, backing away. Don't worry, he said, from a safe distance. Come on, hop up now and... He struggled to think of something she could do. You can help me mash the potatoes. I bet you're a great masher. Bea said nothing, but kicked wildly again and thumped the floor for good measure, the rainbow tail of her unicorn onesie bouncing with each movement. I want Mummy, she sobbed. Mummy! Leave her, said Ethan, turning back towards the kitchen. She's just trying to get attention. This is what she does, like, every day. It's so boring. Dan hesitated, feeling powerless. Bea sounded genuinely distraught. He couldn't simply abandon her there. What else could he offer his niece other than potato mashing? He began, his mind unhelpfully blank. But before he could think of anything, there came a shout from the kitchen. Uncle Dan, did you know that the sausages are on fire? Chapter 2. Dinner wasn't exactly the most tempting meal of Dan's life. The sausages were blackened. The mash was lumpy, the carrots woody and underdone. This is disgusting, pouted Bea, her eyelashes still spangled with tears. It's pretty gross, agreed Gabe, who had curly brown hair and wore a mud-smeared football kit. He added a massive splodge of ketchup to his mash and stirred it together. Pink mash, yuck, he said, with undisguised glee. Now it looks like a road accident, brains everywhere. Gabe, said Ethan, shut up. Make me, jeered Gabe, holding up a fork full of pink mash and letting it drop in soft, wet dollops onto the plate. Brains, he crowed, sneaking a look at his brother. Ethan scowled, and Dan found himself wondering where Zoe was and how long she intended to stay away. Also, whether his woefully late appearance at the door had been the final straw after the worst 3 weeks of her life. Bea pushed her plate back in mutiny, and Dan felt compelled to act fast before the meal plunged to even more dismal depths. This is a fairly rubbish dinner, he said, before quickly adding, my fault, not your mum's, in case anyone saw fit to dob him in for it later. So where's the nearest chip shop round here? His words were like a magic spell, as all 3 of their heads whipped round towards him. Yes, okay, he was desperate, and guilt had made him a pushover. It's on Santicum Road, said Ethan, like 5 minutes walk, 4 if we're quick. Are we really going to have chips? Asked Bea, with an air of faint suspicion. Actually, really, and truly. Chips, cheered Gabe, who seemed to have no such doubts. He stabbed his knife and fork vertically into the revolting pink mash, then leapt off his chair and struck a superhero pose. Chips to the rescue! His enthusiasm was infectious. Chips are my actual favourite, Bea squealed. Even Ethan jumped up from the table with a newly eager air. What are we waiting for? Asked Dan, and they abandoned the rubbish dinner and set off. First lesson in childcare. Buy them off with fried food, he thought, with a wince as they headed along the road, hoping very much that they wouldn't bump into Zoe on her way back. Sorry, Zoe. Sorry, Patrick, Just filling your kids up with grease and salt because I couldn't even manage to keep the sausages from catching fire. Looking on the bright side, though, I didn't burn the house down, right? Not yet, anyway. Still, at least everyone had cheered up. Bea was skipping and twirling around each lamppost, singing about chicken nuggets, while Gabe gave Dan a lengthy account of that afternoon's school football club. He seemed to have scored about 18 goals, according to his version of events, including several headers, an overhead kick, and one from the halfway line. Unbelievable, Dan said each time, which about summed it up. Ethan was the only one who was silent, and Dan shot him a look. "Everything all right, E?" he asked. Gabe, interrupted from a story about an amazing volley that had resulted in him getting his first hat-trick, glanced across at his brother. "Oh," he said, scrunching up his nose. There was something appealingly just Williamish about Gabe, with his unruly springy hair and freckles, plus his almost permanent air of dishevelment. "It's 'cause I'm talking about football. It makes him really angry, because he's got anger management problems and—" "Shut up, dumbass," said Ethan, elbowing him, whereupon Gabe promptly jostled him back. "See?" he cried, dodging away as Ethan glowered and made a proper swing for him. "See that, Uncle Dan? Anger issues. That's what his teacher told Mum, and Ow! See? And now he's hitting me." "Come on, less of that," Dan said, to no effect whatsoever. "Boys." He was relieved to see the lights of the chip shop ahead, like a welcome beacon, as the two of them began scuffling in earnest. Gabe had always had a knack of winding his older brother up, but Ethan looked positively murderous this time as he hit out at Gabe. "Enough for you two. We're here now. Pack it in," Dan said, grabbing them both and pulling them apart. "Right then, guys. What do you all want?" "I'm not a guy, actually," Bea reminded him. "But I would like chicken nuggets and chips, please, Uncle Dan." Ethan was still white in the face, whereas Gabe looked sweatily bullish. Clearly the magic offered by a bag of chips couldn't solve everything, although the two boys did stop trying to punch each other long enough to mumble their requests, at least. Small mercies. Back at the house, as everyone tucked in with rather more appetite, Dan kept glancing over at the clock as it ticked through the minutes, with no sign of Zoe's return. He had one ear tuned to the sound of the front door while the kids chatted, wondering if she still accidentally listened out for Patrick coming home at this time of day. You would, wouldn't you? Some habits were so ingrained they were muscle memory, wired into your cells. After Rebecca left, Dan hadn't been able to sleep in the empty bed because he kept waiting for her to get in beside him. He still thought about her on what had been their wedding anniversary and her birthday. The memories less painful every year, but bittersweet nonetheless. But anyway, he was trying his best to keep her out of his head, especially after... Don't go there, he told himself quickly. He had wasted enough time agonizing over her lately. It was 6:30 once they'd finished eating. Now what? Dan wondered. Would Zoe be back before the kids' bedtime, or was he meant to do that too? "Does anyone have any homework?" he asked, at which their faces fell. "Or we could play a game of something?" he added hastily. Ethan sloped off upstairs, whereas Gabe claimed he needed to finish the level of the Thor game he'd been glued to on the Xbox earlier, which left Bea, who told Dan that she did want to play something. Unicorns. This involved Dan crawling around the playroom while Bea rode imperiously on his back, occasionally casting spells that allowed them to fly to various magical lands together. She seemed so much more cheerful that he didn't dare complain about the friction burns he could foresee appearing on his hands, although he did feel tremendous relief when Gabe called through to say that it was 7 o'clock and bedtime for baby Bea. After the inevitable argument with her brother about how she wasn't a baby, and he was a pig, actually, she eventually acquiesced and trudged upstairs. Childcare was exhausting, thought Dan, as he supervised his niece's teeth brushing in the bathroom a short while later. How had Zoe managed to deal with this alone, day after day? Managing the turbulence of her children's grief on top of her own, soldiering miserably through each long evening without her husband there. It seemed unthinkable. Barely possible. "Oh, am I meant to be giving you a bath?" he asked, belatedly noticing a line of animal flannels along the edge of the tub. Said Bea, through a mouthful of foaming toothpaste. "Usually I have a bath, then brush my teeth. You got it wrong, actually, Uncle Dan." "Oh dear," he said. "Never mind. You can go to sleep stinky this once, I'm sure." "Girls don't stink," Bea told him, outraged. "Anyway," she went on as if something had just occurred to her, "how can I sleep without a story from Mummy?" She rinsed her toothbrush and made a big show of spitting flamboyantly into the sink. "And the Daddy song?" "What's the Daddy song?" Dan asked, following her into the very pink, bunting-adorned princess kingdom that was her bedroom. The walls, the curtains, the carpet all glowed a warm rosy hue, with a sparkly fairy tale palace painted above the bed. Dan found himself imagining Patrick up a ladder painting the walls and hanging the pastel bunting, and felt the hairs on the back of his neck tingle. How he had doted on his little girl. Unzipping her unicorn onesie and tossing it to the floor, Bea began singing, her voice high and sweet, although becoming somewhat muffled as she peeled off her school uniform and her jumper got stuck around her head. "Daddy, I miss you every day. You were my favourite in every way. Please come back to me. Love, Bea." If Dan had been feeling sad before, his grief now threatened to choke him. How could a 6-year-old come to terms with losing a parent, when previously the world had been nothing but magic and fairy tales? He could hardly bear to imagine. "That's a lovely song," he croaked, as she hoisted up a pair of pyjama bottoms, then attempted a wobbly headstand on the bed. "Really special. Did you make it up yourself?" Her legs crashed down and she giggled, then put on her pyjama top. "Mummy helped a bit," she conceded, negotiating the armholes. "Like, one word, and some of the tune. But I did the rest." He gave her a hug because he couldn't find the words for a moment. "I miss him too," he said, her small body crushed against his. "He was your brother," she said, pulling back after a few seconds and looking at him. They were so close that he could see every blonde eyelash. Her blue eyes were steady and appraising, just like Zoe's, but her slightly pointy ears and expressive eyebrows were most definitely from her dad. "Yes." Bea shrugged, wrinkling her nose. "I don't mind if my brothers die," she said heartlessly. "But I miss my daddy. A lot. This much." She elaborated, stretching her arms wide. "He was funny, wasn't he?" Dan said. "Yes, he was really funny. And he would throw me around sometimes, really high in the air so it was like flying." She wriggled out of his arms and leapt on the bed. "And he gave me piggybacks and let me tickle his hair. And when he laughed, he did this. Ha 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 ha." She threw back her head in an uncanny impression of Patrick, and Dan shut his eyes briefly because he knew exactly what she meant. He was a good daddy. He agreed. His emotions were swelling and heaving like a rising tide. He needed to change the subject before he was dragged under. "Right then," he said. "You'd better hop under those covers quick and go to sleep." She snuggled beneath the duvet and stretched up her arms for a last cuddle, winding them around his neck as he leaned in. "Good night, Daddy," she said in his ear, and he stiffened. Had it been a slip of the tongue, he wondered? Or was she pretending, for comfort? Either way, his heart was cracking. "Now you say, 'Good night, little bee,'" she instructed, her breath warm and minty against his neck. The rock in his throat was becoming more boulder-like by the second, and he had to really force it back down before he could speak. "Good night, little bee," he echoed. She let go and rolled onto her side. "Buzz, buzz," she murmured, then shut her eyes. Dan said nothing for a moment, in case further orders were issued. But she remained silent, and almost immediately her breathing began to deepen and lengthen. He gazed at her with a pain in his chest. "Good night, Daddy," he heard her say again, and the poignancy of the words took his breath away. However she might be working through her grief and pain, coming up so close to it felt pretty shattering. "Oh, poor you," scoffed Zoe in his head. "It's all about you, isn't it, Dan?" By the time he had left Bee's bedroom and returned downstairs, it was 7:30 and dark outside, but there was still no sign of his sister-in-law. He wondered what she was doing now, if she was with friends in a noisy bar, or within the soothing sanctuary of someone's house, if she was steaming drunk, or crying, or both. "Gabe," he called, going into the living room, then stopped at the sight of his younger nephew fast asleep on the sofa, still fully dressed and clutching the game controller. Gabe's face, usually so animated, was softened with sleep, his mouth slack, his thick, full eyelashes quivering mid-dream. Dan found himself thinking back to when Gabe was born, how he and Rebecca had looked after Ethan while Zoe was in labour, before Patrick's jubilant phone call had finally come. Little boy, well, not so little really. He's 9 pounds 3 ounces, an absolute whopper. Trust Gabe to start life with a bang. Dan remembered that day particularly for how much he'd loved hanging out with Ethan. It was the first time he and Rebecca had had sole responsibility for a child, and he'd really enjoyed it. They'd gone to the park and played in the sandpit together. Then, back at the flat, Dan had found a leftover roll of wallpaper, spreading it across the floor so that they could draw a complicated road network for Ethan's toy car to drive along. Having been a bit apprehensive about entertaining his small, solemn nephew for possibly a day or more, Dan felt a glow inside as it became clear that the boy was relaxed and happy, chatting away as they drew. "I'm doing all right here," he told himself, praising Ethan for his scribbly contributions. "I can do this." Later, they took Ethan to the hospital to meet his new brother, witnessing at first hand the warmth and wonder of the maternity ward. Patrick and Zoe so delighted. Zoe's mum and stepdad arriving from South Wales, his own parents there too, everyone celebrating. All the joy gave Dan an unexpected pang of envy for what Patrick had. The children, the family life, that whole future they were building for themselves. It must have shown on his face that evening, because when he turned to Rebecca with the question, half formed on his lips, she'd shaken her head before he'd even managed to ask it. "Oh no," she said. They were in bed together, her long auburn hair loose about her shoulders, and she wagged a finger forbiddingly. "Stop right there. I know what you're going to say, and the answer is no way. Stretch marks and stitches? Not for me." If he'd been listening for it, Dan might have heard a ghostly bell tolling a faint warning just then. But in the next second, she'd whipped the covers back to reveal her flat belly and small, perfect breasts, which distracted him. I'm not ruining these, either. After all the Pilates I've done, and that sodding fasting, it would be a tragedy. Needless to say, he'd agreed with her at the time. He would have agreed with anything she'd said at that precise moment, let's face it. 9 years on, anyway, newborn baby Gabriel had grown into this scrappy, charming and opinionated child, who was now spark out on the sofa. Dan scooped him up with the same tentative care as when he'd held him in the maternity ward for the first time. But there was not a murmur, not a flicker. All that football plus a plate of fat vinegary chips had done for him. The landline started ringing as Dan was halfway up the stairs and he froze, dreading the noise disturbing Gabe, but the boy slumbered on, oblivious. After a few rings, the answer phone kicked in, and a cross-sounding woman launched into a message. This is Mrs. Henderson from Townley Street. I've left so many messages on your mobile. I've given up and got this number from directory inquiries, and you're still not answering. If you have a shred of decency, then please call me back. The boiler's playing up again and we've been without hot water for 2 weeks. It's not on. Presumably the woman was one of Patrick's tenants, who had no way of knowing that he had died, Dan realised. Having worked in the building trade since leaving school, Patrick had made a lot of money, fast, by buying up derelict properties, renovating them, and then selling them on at vast profits. More recently, he had accumulated 6 or 7 West London flats and kept them on as rentals. The plan had been to earn some easy money on the side of his main building work, but he'd often grumbled about his tenants' inability to change a light bulb without phoning him to complain about it. Still, a broken boiler was a different matter. Dan figured that Patrick's work mobile was no doubt as dead as he was, and almost certainly full of other similar messages. On went poor unlistened to Mrs. Henderson, ranting into the answer phone, while Dan continued up to the landing, his sleeping nephew surprisingly heavy in his arms. Gabe's small bedroom was next to Bee's, and was plastered with posters of Fulham Football Club and various superheroes in action poses. As Dan lowered the boy gently onto the bed, he noticed that someone, Zoe, Gabe himself, had blue-tacked a photo on the wall nearby at pillow height of Patrick and Gabe at a Fulham match. There they were together, holding an end each of a black and white scarf above their heads, both of them open-mouthed with a cheer by the look of it. They had the same lips, Dan noticed, wide and full, prone to forming shouts and smiles in equal measure. His heart ached as he saw a smudgy fingerprint on the photo and imagined Gabe lying there, reaching to touch his dad's face before he went to sleep every night. He was too old for a daddy song of his own, but he still needed something, clearly. Didn't they all? Gently rolling the Star Wars duvet out from underneath Gabe, Dan peeled off his nephew's football socks before deciding to leave the rest of his kit on for the night. It was Friday, so there was no school in the morning at least. He pulled the duvet up to Gabe's chin, shut the curtains, and left the room. 2 down, 1 to go, he thought, padding downstairs where the irate tenant was still voicing her displeasure into the answer phone. I said to the Citizens Advice Bureau, this is the worst landlord I've ever had. He's an absolute disgrace, completely unreliable and... Complaints about a dodgy boiler were one thing, but having the house filled with slurs against his brother was too close to the bone. Hurrying down the last few stairs, Dan snatched up the receiver. He's dead, he said coldly. He's dead. And I'm sorry you've got a problem with your boiler or whatever, but your landlord, my brother, died last month, and that's why he's not been answering your calls. Got that? And then he slammed the phone down again, before sinking to the bottom step, his hands rising instinctively to cradle his own head. He took several deep breaths, taken aback by his own burst of temper. He'd always been the calmer of the two brothers, the one to pause and think carefully rather than allow his impulses free rein. Tonight, though, he felt raw, uncontained, his emotions highly charged after the hours spent with his niece and nephews. He rubbed his face, his temper dropping away as quickly as it had flared up. How was this woman to know what had happened? Then, with a groan of regret, he reached forward, took the phone again, and pressed last number redial. "I'm sorry," he said when she replied. "I'm Patrick's brother, Dan. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that. We're all still a bit at sea without him." The phrase seemed wholly inadequate. "We are broken without him," he should have said. "We are drowning in his loss." Then he cringed at how inappropriate these words were. "It was very sudden and unexpected," he finished, hoping she wouldn't ask any questions. The woman, Mrs. Henderson, had she said, took a moment to respond. "I understand," she said, "and I'm sorry too, for saying those things and upsetting you, not to mention sorry that you've lost him." She hesitated. But then her voice trailed away almost immediately, as if forbidding herself to start complaining again. "Not now. A man has died, remember?" "I get it," he said, filling the space. "You're fed up and nobody's returned your calls or helped you. Fair enough." And then, because he didn't feel he could really ignore the problem now, he added, "I could have a look at the boiler for you. Not tonight, obviously, but maybe tomorrow?" "Oh, would you?" Her relief was almost palpable. "I'd really appreciate that. I've got young children, you see, and we're having to go next door to friends' houses to shower and, well, it's been going on for a fortnight now and my friends have been wonderful, but we can't carry on like this. It's really getting me down." "Of course it must be. And I'm sorry," he said again. "Let me take down your details. What time tomorrow would be best for you?" He reached around for something to write on and saw another pile of unopened posts sitting there on the hall table. He flipped the letters over to see that most of them were addressed to Patrick. "Go on," he said to Mrs. Henderson, jotting down her details on one of the envelopes and reflecting on how hard it was to lose someone when the rest of the world hadn't yet caught up with the news. All those people you had to keep telling again and again before they stopped ringing and writing and asking for things. All the mailing lists and databases a person ended up on, how every entry had to be deleted one after another. It was bad enough trying to handle the shock yourself, but for Zoe, having to repeat the news endlessly to person after person, and then feeling obliged to respond to their shock and condolences and questions. It must scrape off the top layer of skin each time, the wound unable to start healing. But he could take some of that away for her, he realised. He could deal with this stack of post if she wanted him to. Go through the phone calls jamming up Patrick's work mobile and the landline answer phone and make sure the grim word got out. To tenants, to the bank, to suppliers. He could take on that responsibility. "Wow, my hero," Zoe said sarcastically in his head. "It's really the least you can do, you know that, don't you?" It was a start, though. It would be something, at least. By now it was past 8 o'clock, and after making arrangements with Mrs. Henderson, call me Ruth, all Dan felt like doing was cracking open a beer and sinking into the sofa. But with Zoe still absent, he had to keep a clear head. Do his bit. So he went up to Ethan's room and knocked gently on the open door. "Hi," he said, poking his head round. Ethan was plugged into some computer game or other, headphones on, bony shoulders tensed, peering intently at his laptop. Killing things, judging by all the flying sparks and explosions on the screen. Dan moved a little nearer into his nephew's field of vision, until Ethan eventually noticed him and jerked round. "Oh, hi," he said, glancing from Dan back to the game, just as a masked gangster shot his character in the head. "Oof," said Dan, as gore splattered the screen. "Sorry, just wanted to see if you're all right." He sat on the edge of the bed, hands between his legs. "If you needed any help with homework or anything?" Not that it looked as if much homework was in the offing. His gaze travelled around the room, taking in the metre-high papier-mâché hand that was giving him the middle finger from the far corner, the large Escher prints, and a metallic collage of the London skyline on the wall, plus the life-size bust of a Greek god wearing a purple party hat by his bed. "You've got some cool stuff in here," he commented. "Thanks," said Ethan. "I don't have any homework." Then he grimaced. "Well, some revision for exams, but..." He shrugged as if to say, "Who gives a shit about exams?" "I can help with that if you want." Dan guessed that exams and schoolwork didn't feel so important anymore when you'd lost your dad. "We could go through it together." He was desperate to help, he realised. Desperate to make up for the evening of Patrick's death, when he'd been oblivious, striding away, all self-righteous and cold. How many hours of exam help, how many daddy songs, how many carries up to bed would it take, though? If he could fill in a few of the gaps that Patrick had left, it would be something, he figured. Right? Ethan didn't seem particularly bowled over by the offers of assistance, though. "Nah," he said, closing down the game on his screen. "It's okay, thanks." "Well, another time then," Dan said. "Hey, what was that all about earlier anyway? You and Gabe scrapping on the way to the chippy. Did I miss something there?" Ethan's face became mask-like. "He's a dick," he said shortly. Dan tried again. "Was it something to do with the sculpture club you were going to? The one your mum didn't want to talk about?" He guessed. Anger issues, Gabe had taunted, but Ethan had never been an angry child before now. His sigh in response was world-weary. "Yeah, it's Wednesday afternoons, the same time as one of Gabe's football sessions, so Mum can't pick me up. She doesn't want me coming back from Wandsworth on my own because I couldn't possibly manage a bus and a tube without being mugged or stabbed or getting lost." He rolled his eyes, a proper glower setting in. "Like, I am 14. Everyone in my year goes all over London on their own. But Mum's got really weird about us doing anything that's not completely, boringly safe. And obviously Gabe can't give up his precious football." It was the longest speech he'd made since Dan had got there, and it took Dan a moment to work through all the resentment simmering within. He nodded, not wanting to take sides or go against Zoe's decision. As for Gabe and the football, he remembered Patrick once joking that Gabe was like a dog. He needed running several times a day, every day, otherwise he became hyper and unmanageable. Zoe had laid down the law here, and he understood why. But all the same, it didn't seem fair on Ethan. "It wouldn't take that long to cycle back," he said, thinking aloud. "Half an hour to get here from Wandsworth?" But he could tell from Ethan's expression that Zoe wouldn't permit cycling either. Too dangerous. Too much of a risk. He got it. When you'd lost your husband so shockingly, so suddenly, of course you were going to be paranoid about bad things happening to your kids too. "How did you get home before?" he asked. "Did your dad pick you up?" Ethan nodded, eyes far away. Remembering fun times in the front of Patrick's van, no doubt. Just the two of them, having a laugh, music blasting. Patrick commenting on attractive women walking past, then winking at his son. "Don't tell your mum I said that." "I could take you instead," Dan offered. "Wednesday afternoons, did you say?" Ethan's face lit up. "Really? Do you mean it?" "Sure, absolutely." As a financial tech consultant, Dan's days were usually spent finding new solutions to clients' tech problems, with little time for much else. But seeing as there were 2 full months left of his sabbatical, he was free to help out, for now at least. Frankly, he would be quite glad of an excuse to leave the flat and be useful to somebody, he realised. Oh my God. For the first time since Dan had seen his nephew that day, there was a flash of genuine happiness on his face. "I'm so..." His chin wobbled. Ethan had always been such a quiet, self-contained kid. Had he been overlooked in the fallout from the family's tragedy? "That would be amazing. Thank you. Are you sure?" "I'm completely sure." Dan wondered if it would be too much to ruffle his nephew's tufty hair, but at the last moment held back. Ethan didn't strike him as a touchy-feely person, and this was strange new ground they found themselves on. "Do you know, earlier on I was thinking back to when Gabe was born," he said suddenly. "You might not remember, but I was looking after you that day, and we ended up drawing together for hours on this great long roll of wallpaper. It started off as a series of roads for your car, but then we added all sorts of weird and wonderful buildings and creatures. Jungles, mountains, cities." His eyes felt hot, thinking back to the sweet, solemn little boy Ethan had been then. How he'd leaned over that paper so intently as they worked on it with their felt tips. They had created their own world, albeit imaginary. How ironic that Dan had inadvertently destroyed Ethan's actual world all these years later. Ethan's face was screwed up in concentration. "I think I do remember," he replied. "We rolled the paper right out and it stretched across the room." "It did. Spot on." They smiled at each other, a tentative, fragile sort of smile, but it counted nonetheless. "Well, I'll leave you to it," Dan said. "And when your mum gets in, I'll tell her about our Wednesday afternoon plan, yeah?" "Yeah. Thanks." "No problem. Oh, and don't forget to brush your teeth before you go to bed, will you?" he added, realising that Gabe had gone to sleep with his teeth unbrushed. Oops. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I'm not a baby," he said. "No, of course you're not. Okay, I'll leave you to it." Dan went back downstairs, feeling very much as if he deserved a beer by now, and hoping that Zoe might have a few in the fridge. Then he saw his bike in the hall and remembered that he still had to cycle home, presumably anyway, assuming that Zoe did eventually reappear. He stood gazing at the front door, wishing he could hear her key in the lock, that she would come back again now. She'd made her point, she'd escaped from the house and kids for a few hours. She'd caused Dan to sweat. She was going to come back, wasn't she? Like, tonight. She wasn't going to stay away for the whole weekend or anything. It was dark outside, headlights gleaming through the black as cars cruised along the street, trying to find parking spaces. The weather forecast he'd heard earlier had predicted a heavy frost tonight, and already the pavements were glistening with the first icy traces. He pulled the living room curtains shut, a swarm of anxious new thoughts invading his head. Standing there in the kitchen earlier, her face sharp with stress and blame, Zoe had seemed at breaking point. What if she'd really had enough and had done something stupid? You heard about people who simply couldn't go on without their partners, who were so destroyed by grief and anger and loss, They could no longer think straight. He went through to the kitchen, feeling uneasy as he pulled down the striped blind, checked the back door was locked. Zoe had thrown up her hands in defeat and marched out of there, deaf to Bee's wails, no hesitation whatsoever. Had she even taken any money with her? He wondered now. Where was she? Clearing up the detritus from their fish and chip takeaway, he washed up the pans from the first aborted dinner and set the dishwasher running. He found himself thinking back to when he and Rebecca split up and he'd rented a temporary flat on Shepherd's Bush Road. How for a while he had been the archetypal bachelor slob again, wallowing in misery and grime, letting the mess accumulate around him and not caring. Ironically, it had been Patrick coming round and saying, "Jesus Christ, Dan," and "This is a shithole," and "God, pull yourself together, will you? Are you having a nervo or something?" that had snapped him out of it. He wiped the surfaces now, wondering if he should do anything about all the clutter piled up around the room, and whether it was any of his business to sort it out, or if Zoe would react angrily and take his interference as criticism. He chucked out the shriveled brown daffodils that had died of thirst in a dry vase, relocated from the fruit bowl to the compost bin a couple of mouldering satsumas that had developed interesting verdigris-like patterns, and cleaned the worst of the dust from the window ledges with some kitchen roll. Should he carry on? Maybe if he'd been a better brother-in-law, in and out over the last few weeks to help with shopping and childcare amidst the family's storm of grief, he would know the best course of action. He'd have earned the right to take charge and rearrange her kitchen. Not today, though. Not yet. He went into the living room and sat down. The house was as quiet as a morgue. He switched on the TV, volume low so as not to disturb anyone, and flicked through the channels, but nothing good was on. He fiddled with his phone, wondering whether or not to call Zoe, but was too weary of her shouting at him again. He sent a text instead. "Hope you are okay. The kids are all fine. I'll stay here till you get back. D." No reply. He leaned against the soft cushions, suddenly weary. He'd managed a lot today, the most, in fact, since Patrick had died, and there was plenty to process. He shut his eyes. All he could do now was wait for Zoe to come home. 2 streets away, Zoe was on her best friend Claire's sofa and making decent inroads into her 3rd glass of wine. "I'm never going home," she announced as the doorbell rang, heralding the arrival of their Indian takeaway. "Is that okay, Claire? If I just stay here and you look after me? You don't mind, do you?" Claire got up to answer the door. "It's gonna be okay, Zoe," she said as she left the room. Zoe slumped like a bag of damp sand, her teeth furry from the wine, her limbs loose and alcohol-sodden. "It's gonna be okay," she repeated to herself in a tiny whisper. But even as she was saying the words, she knew they couldn't possibly be true. How could anything ever be okay again without Patrick?
This is the end of CD1. The book continues on CD2. CD2.
Chapter 3. "Let's have a look, then," Dan said, peering at the controls on Ruth Henderson's boiler the following morning and hoping he looked vaguely knowledgeable. It was a vain hope. No doubt, after the precious little sleep he'd had the night before, he'd ended up dozing off on Zoe's sofa sometime around midnight, waking up several hours later when she crashed back into the house, incoherent and smelling strongly of wine. He'd lain awake afterwards for what felt like ages, the sofa fabric prickly against his face, as his mind looped ceaselessly, too wired to stop. In the wake of Patrick's death, he had gone about things all wrong, he kept thinking. He had to figure out how he could start making amends. Step number 1 on the atonement trail had begun right here. The small cold kitchen of the Henderson family, in a scruffy terrace street behind Charing Cross Hospital. Dan stared uncomprehendingly at the dead boiler, trying to remember the YouTube videos he'd watched 20 minutes earlier, detailing how to restart the pilot light, wondering if he might blow the place up if he fumbled a crucial part of the job. Getting out his phone to check would not exactly fill Mrs. Henderson with confidence, he imagined, but it was preferable to the house collapsing in rubble. Zoe had been quiet that morning when she emerged, bags under her eyes, her face pale and creased as she knotted a raspberry pink toweling dressing gown around her middle. "Sorry about last night," she mumbled, before going through to the kitchen to make coffee. Dan, who had been awake since 6:30 when the unexpectedly bright March sunshine jabbed through the thin curtains, couldn't tell if she wanted to talk or for him to leave without further discussion. But he'd been so absent over the last few weeks, he felt he should at least stick around for coffee. He'd done enough flaking out recently. "That's okay," he'd said, going over to the window and pulling up the blind. The garden appeared dishevelled after its wintry battering, the lawn mossy from all the rain they'd had. "Did you have a good time?" She glanced at him suspiciously, as if wondering whether he was taking the mick. "Yeah," she said after a moment. "Went to my friend Claire's. Put the world to rights over approximately 17 bottles of wine. Not feeling quite so triumphant this morning, but it seemed a good idea at the time." She put a mug of coffee on the table in front of him, steam twining up like tendrils. "Thank you for holding the fort," she added. "And sorry if I said anything I shouldn't have when I got in." "You were fine," he replied, deciding it was probably the gallant thing to gloss over her return. "Zoe, I won't leave you in the lurch again," he went on. "I mean it. We're still family, aren't we? You and me." The words rang in his head now as he carefully took the front off Ruth Henderson's boiler. Families stuck together and stood shoulder to shoulder when times were bad. Zoe's face had sagged with relief when he offered to take over the care of Patrick's landlord affairs while still on sabbatical, starting today. Her lower lip had wobbled when he said he could drive Ethan to the sculpture club every Wednesday, no problem at all. And she had nodded several times, quite hard, when he offered to come back later tomorrow so that she could give him a list of everything else that might be helpful. "Thank you," she said quietly, and for a moment he felt not forgiven exactly, but as if he had done something good for once, worthwhile. He would do anything she asked of him, he'd vowed there and then, whatever it took to prove he was sorry. In the meantime, he really needed to get this boiler working again. Okay, gas valve, that must be it. The words on-off pilot were printed on the knob. "Oh," said Mrs. Henderson from behind him. "If you're trying to start the pilot light, we've already done that 1,000 times. My neighbour found a YouTube video and we followed the instructions, but nothing happened." "Ah," said Dan, feeling like an idiot. "In that case..." "The problem's clearly not with the gas supply, as the cooker's still working fine, and it's not the timer that's faulty either. We've checked all those things." Her smile was rather fixed as he withdrew his head from the cupboard, her eyes flicking upwards as they heard the raggedy cry of a baby starting up from above their heads. "I did try what I could while I was waiting for your brother to get back to me." She grimaced. "Sorry, I don't mean to..." "It's all right, I know." He looked down at his feet for a moment, then decided he should come clean. "Look, I'm sorry, I can't fix this for you. I work in finance, not as a boiler engineer, so your guess is as good as mine here. I should have realised you'd have tried everything yourself. So, what I'll do, he said quickly as her face fell, is call an emergency heating engineer right now and book someone to come out today. I'll wait in for them, if you've got stuff to do. Upstairs, the baby's crying was becoming louder, rising to a crescendo, and then a small girl with wild red curls and a knitted blue rabbit in hand rushed into the kitchen, breathless with self-importance. "Mum, Phoebe's woke up." "I know, love, I'll be there in a minute," said Mrs. Henderson. "Could you be a really good helper for me and just go in there and pat her tummy very, very gently? Say hello in a kind voice." For a stupid split second, Dan thought she was asking him to do these things. But then the little girl whirled around, the blue rabbit's legs flying out behind her, and they heard her pounding upstairs on her mission. "Thank you," Mrs. Henderson said to Dan. "That would be great. Getting someone out today, I mean. And if you could wait in for them too, that would be even better. My husband's coming back from a conference later and there's not a crumb of food in the house, so we really need to—" She broke off as the crying upstairs reached a new, more urgent pitch. "I'd better see what's happening," she said, hurrying from the room. It turned out that getting an emergency heating engineer to call on a Saturday was going to be very, very expensive. It also transpired that, following the recent cold snap, there were many boilers that had suffered similar deaths, and Dan could be waiting hours for someone to fix this one. "Fine," he sighed, knowing he had no choice. In fact, the more costly and inconvenient the experience was going to be, the better in some ways, he thought, except in a mug of stewed tea from Mrs. Henderson, Ruth, and assuring her that no, he didn't mind hanging around for the engineer while she went to the supermarket. It was no problem. Any cost, money or time, that he could pay was some tiny coin of penitence to deduct from the gigantic debt of guilt he was surely destined to carry around forever. This was the balance sheet of his conscience from now on, he thought, as Ruth departed with the kids and the house fell quiet. Working in finance, he knew his way around a set of company accounts and had always found satisfaction in tallying up income and outgoings, all those crumpled receipts and invoices being converted to clean, clear, final figures. In his case, because of what had happened with Patrick, he was probably in the red for the rest of his life, but he could at least attempt to rack up a hefty number of good deeds in counterbalance, to show the universe he was truly sorry. Just at that moment, there was a knock at the door, and he opened it to see a man holding a toolbox with an expectant air. "I'm here about your boiler." Showing the engineer through to the chilly kitchen, Dan experienced the first flicker of optimism he'd felt in a long time. Whatever it took, however much it cost, he was going to step into his brother's shoes and pick up the reins of his life. He would fix this. All of it. Chapter 4. Patrick Christopher Shepherd was the best of all men. Zoe murmured to herself as she walked along. A loving father, husband and son, who was liked and respected by everyone. Her throat tightened as she thought of his handsome face. The laugh she'd never hear again, the lips she could no longer kiss. It was one of her ongoing regrets that she hadn't felt able to give a personal eulogy at Patrick's funeral. Others had stepped up. Her father-in-law, Derek, had made a stilted speech about his son that didn't capture any of Patrick's warmth and love of life. Although that was Derek for you, she supposed. A man who wouldn't recognise human warmth unless his house was on fire. Dan had also spoken during the service, stammering about what a great brother Patrick had been, along with a couple of anecdotes, but he had been wave-faced and uneasy, talking without any real conviction. Zoe had sat there in her new black suit with her head down, anger rising at what a bad job they were both doing. Did she want to hear the opinion of Derek, who, according to Patrick, had been such a cold-blooded father he was practically reptilian? No, she did not. Did she want to hear funny stories from Dan, whom she still blamed for Patrick's death? No, she did not. And so the service had come to an end without anyone standing up and giving the whole-hearted, loving, sincere tribute that Patrick deserved. Nobody had been able to convey his humour, his charisma, his energy. At the time, Zoe could hardly croak out a sentence without breaking down, and so she had failed him too, with her silence. Still, between now and the summer, she planned to perfect the most beautiful tribute to her husband and declaim it as she scattered his ashes. It was the least she could do. I knew, as soon as I saw him, he was special. She practiced aloud. She'd been 25 when they met in a grotty pub where Patrick teased her about her karaoke skills, bought her a drink, and then proceeded to charm her and make her laugh pretty much for the next 17 years straight. At the time, she'd been wary of men. She'd had her heart broken a couple of times by previous crappy boyfriends, and was of course scarred by her own philandering dad walking out on the family. But Patrick was different. He was just good. She had trusted him instinctively, and her instincts had not let her down. Today was Monday, the start of a new week, which always seemed particularly tough. 7 more dreary and joyless days without her husband, and absolutely nothing to look forward to. Keep going, Zoe. 1 foot in front of the other, her friend Claire had encouraged on Friday night. Hang in there, my love, her mum had urged on the phone the night before, but it was so bloody hard getting up some mornings, so hard to chivvy the kids into their school uniform and out of the front door, when she felt like staying in bed all day with the covers pulled up over her head. Zoe was a primary school teacher, although after Bea was born she'd switched to working on a supply basis only, finding that juggling her own 3 children with the 30 in her class, day in, day out, was too much to handle all of a sudden. Since Patrick's death, she had stayed away from the classroom altogether. His life insurance had recently come through, a generous package, which had taken the pressure off financially, thank goodness. But it had also taken away any incentive she might have had to work again. "How are you feeling about getting back into teaching?" Claire had asked the other evening, once the wine had loosened them up. "Or is it too soon to ask? Only it might be a distraction, that's all. It might help." Zoe knew the question was meant kindly, and that Claire was just trying to haul her back towards normality. The problem was, she couldn't imagine ever feeling like standing in front of a class of children and talking about phonics or times tables or the Victorians again. The Zoe who put on a nice blouse and skirt every morning, who kissed her husband and children goodbye before heading to work. The Zoe who was able to inspire and educate a class of 9-year-olds. That cheerful, carefree woman had vanished. Instead, here was this angry, weeping mess of a person who shouted at her kids and forgot things, who couldn't sleep at night for worrying about what was to become of them all. When she eventually fell asleep, she would dream of Patrick, often that she was diving into the river trying to rescue him. Sometimes she would spot his body in the water and be heaving with all her might to haul him up to the surface from the murky depths, uselessly, helplessly, because at some point in the nightmare she would realise that he was already dead and she was too late. Other times she would glimpse him drifting away from her, slipping through the reeds and shadows. "Wait!" she'd yell, silver bubbles rising from her mouth as she tried to reach him. "Stop!" But he never did, and she could never catch up, however hard she swam in those dreams, however desperately she shouted his name. She would wake up, panting and gasping for air, as if she too had been submerged under the muddy Thames. And a few seconds later she'd realise that here was another awful day, and the horror of real life would swing into place once more. What happened to you that night? She wanted to cry to him. What actually happened? Maybe, she replied to Claire's question. But not yet. It's too soon. Too soon. As if this was merely a temporary loss. As if she wouldn't always feel this way. That didn't seem remotely likely right now, when she felt like half a person, a crumbling wreck of a survivor. At home, she was clinging onto her sanity, but all around her, chaos threatened to break in. The house was becoming grubbier by the day because she didn't care enough to hoover and mop. It was so chaotic that Liz, Patrick's mum, had taken to silently sorting and ironing laundry whenever she popped round, squirting bleach around the loo now and then, sliding a casserole or a crumble into the fridge for Zoe to reheat. These acts of kindness only made Zoe feel ashamed, though, as if her mother-in-law was judging her on her slovenliness, the lingering smell of bleach a reprimand that she was failing her family. If you'd asked her a month ago, Zoe would have said that she was the one who did everything around the house. But it was becoming apparent there were plenty of chores that Patrick had taken care of after all. Cutting the front hedge, for instance, cleaning the compost bin, managing bills and washing the cars and taking stuff to the tip. One of the brackets on Gabe's curtain rail had come loose, and Zoe hadn't got round to fixing it yet. It was the sort of job that would have taken her husband 5 minutes, but she felt nervous about using the drill. Which size bit did she need? Which colour raw plug? Her car insurance was due for renewal, and usually Patrick shopped around to find a good deal for her. But she would have to do that herself this time. As for his car, she supposed she'd have to sell it, but she didn't even know how to go about such a thing. Sure, she could ask her stepdad or brother, but even that felt like another task to add to her list. The sum of it all was overwhelming. Impossible. Far easier somehow to do none of it, to let herself sink further into the mess, until it eventually consumed her. Recently, she had taken to walking for hours at a time while the kids were in school, haunting parks and streets like a mournful ghost, in an attempt to compensate for her intake of crisps, which was getting dangerously out of hand, as well as to escape the messy house. She dragged herself around the botanic gardens some days, dimly noticing the narcissi nodding their pearly heads and trying not to think about how many times Patrick had given her daffodils over the years. She'd kept the last bunch he'd bought her for weeks after his death, unable to throw them out. Dan must have binned them, she'd realised the other day, and it was all she could do to stop herself scavenging through the bin, trying to salvage a few brown petals. Today she had walked as far as Chiswick and abandoned her eulogy attempts as she drifted like a wraith past the shops on the high road, trying to remember how to act like an ordinary person. Other women knew what to do, she thought dully, pulling her scarf tighter around her throat as she saw clusters of them sitting inside cafes or holding up clothes to show one another in boutiques. Other women jogged together through parks and green spaces, their gleaming trainers pounding along in sync. They pushed grizzling tots in buggies alongside one another and invited each other round for coffee, chat, chat, chat. Zoe could no longer move in these circles with such thoughtless ease, though. She had become an outsider, unwelcome. Turned out that when you lost your husband and all-time love of your life, other people found you awkward company. They were afraid of being too happy or glib in your presence. They felt they had to adopt hushed tones and touch your arm as they tilted their heads to one side. How are you? Always the how are yous, eyes wide with concern. It was driving her nuts, frankly. The worst thing, one of the many worst things, was that she would always be marked out in this way now. Always branded as poor Zoe, poor widowed Zoe. So sad, wasn't it? Have you heard? Oh my God, I couldn't believe it. Do you think it was suicide? I heard a rumour that they had money troubles. You're kidding. Who would have thought it? Oh, she'd heard all the whispers, seen the nudges and glances, however sympathetically people might act to her face. Ignore them, she reminded herself. Don't get paranoid on top of everything else. She was outside and in the fresh air. Well, as fresh as it got on Turnham Green Road anyway. And she had managed to survive all the way to 11 o'clock this morning without crying. Also, silver lining. Yesterday Dan had reappeared, and even though she still hadn't forgiven him, and probably never would, he was at least offering support, which she had grudgingly accepted. He'd collected a mountain of paperwork and posts that had built up, untouched in Patrick's absence, and had taken the lot away, promising to deal with everything. This was progress, she supposed. A tiny step forward through the misery. Just as she was daring to feel positive, however, a man walked past her with the same aftershave that Patrick had always worn, and she found herself instantly floored by the familiar scent. The blood drained from her face at the spicy, woody fragrance, the heavenly smell that brought to mind all those nights when he'd worn it. Restaurant dinners and parties, nights in the pub, his arms around her. She'd been spraying the cologne onto his pillow every night so that she could hug it, and the bottle was nearly empty. Would it be ridiculous of her to buy more? She just missed him so much. She was lost without him. So lost. A sob escaped her, then another. Here it came, the desolation, roaring up inside as if it had been lurking beneath the surface the whole time, waiting for her to crack. She put her hands over her eyes and leaned against the nearest shop window, legs shaking. What was she even doing here? So much for hiding in plain sight amongst the yummy mummies of Chiswick. Now she had outed herself as a grieving wreck, a woman who fell apart at a single floating waft of Givenchy, tears coursing down her face in public. She didn't know what to do with herself. There was nowhere to hide, and yet she couldn't pull herself together. She couldn't stop crying. Are you okay? No, you're not. I can see you're not. Come inside the shop. Come and get your breath back for a moment. A woman was talking to her, her face quite close, although Zoe's eyes were too full of tears to really see anything. An arm slipped around her back, then she was gently led through the shop door. Just a minute, let me, said the woman, and Zoe was dimly aware of her closing the door behind them and flipping a sign to closed. They were in a small homewares boutique, full of beautiful cushions and throws, as well as shelves of vases and ceramics, the sort of place she would never dare bring her children for fear of expensive accidents. The woman who had rescued her guided her towards a rather lovely pink velvet armchair with elegant wooden legs. Sit down, she encouraged. Zoe sat. I'm sorry, she gulped, mortified that this was happening. She put her head in her hands, still trembling with emotions, and tried desperately to pull herself together. God, I'm so embarrassed and sorry, she managed to say. You're fine. Don't worry. Just have a moment, the woman said, grabbing a box of tissues from behind the counter. Here, take these. Can I make you a coffee? Peppermint tea? No, thank you, sniffled Zoe, hiccuping as she tried to force her breathing under control. She'd always teased Patrick for being a hypochondriac. Call an ambulance. My husband has a cold. But if she had any clue that he was actually going to die on her, she'd have tended to him far more lovingly. Why hadn't she cared for him more when she had the chance? Why had she ever been mean to him, argued with him? A biscuit, then. You look very pale, if you don't mind me saying. Mind you, don't we all, after this horrible winter? Here, take one. You'll be doing me a favour. I'll only eat them all otherwise, said the woman, waving a packet of chocolate digestives under Zoe's nose. She was wearing a short, loud patchwork skirt, Zoe noticed, with a silky black top and a chunky copper necklace that clinked like tiny cymbals whenever she moved. The smell of the digestives was surprisingly uplifting. Zoe was ravenous after the walk, she realised, And, come to think of it, had forgotten to eat breakfast in all the palaver of the Monday morning school rush earlier. "Thank you," she said, taking a biscuit and nibbling the edge. Sugary crumbs exploded in her mouth, and she took another bite, resisting the urge to cram the whole thing in at once. It was delicious and made her feel the tiniest bit more able to function. "Sorry," she said again, aware of how peculiar her behaviour must appear. "I lost my husband recently, or rather, he died. I haven't just mislaid him somewhere." She grimaced, risking a look up at the other woman, braced for a weary "what have I got myself into" expression on her face. But her rescuer gazed back with compassion instead, her chocolate brown eyes sincere. She was younger than Zoe, mid-30s at a guess, and pretty with long chestnut hair and freckles. "Oh God," she said. "How awful. I'm so sorry. You must be going through hell." Zoe had to press her lips together because there was so much sympathy in the other woman's voice that she could hardly bear it. Also because hell just about summed up her life these days. "I am," she admitted shakily. "It's been the worst thing ever. And I smelled my husband's aftershave on another man just now and..." She could feel her face rushing with hot colour. "I know it sounds silly, but it caught me off guard. Little things keep doing that." "I bet they do," said the woman. "It must take ages to process a loss like that." She waggled the biscuit packet temptingly again. "Have another," she urged. Then, as Zoe dipped her hand obediently into the crinkling wrapper, she said, "Do you want to talk, or would you rather sit and get your breath back? You're welcome to stay here as long as you like, obviously, but I could call someone to pick you up if that would help." Calling someone and drawing any more attention to her tearful breakdown was the last thing Zoe wanted. The idea alone was enough to propel her to her feet, knees still wobbly, but determined to hold fast. Forget the biscuits. It was time to go. A customer was at the shop door now, peering through the glass as if wondering what was going on inside, and Zoe's cheeks burned. "It's fine," she said, which wasn't true, but never mind. "Anyway, I'd better..." She gestured towards the street outside, real life waiting for her re-entry. "I'll leave you to it, but thank you." She forced her mouth to smile and walked quickly towards the door. "Nothing to see here. I am absolutely fine, 100% okay. Do not ask another question." "No problem," said the woman from behind her, but Zoe didn't turn back. "Keep walking, she ordered herself, and her body obeyed, taking her out through the door again and into the street, quickly past the shop window, where the woman was probably still staring worriedly at her, and away. Anywhere. Just away and fast. "I've lost the plot," she said to herself, not sure whether to laugh or cry. "Were you watching that, Patrick? I've totally lost the plot without you." Chapter 5. 2 days later, Dan parked along the street from a large, noisy, comprehensive school and peered through the windscreen, feeling slightly overwhelmed as hundreds of kids poured out, all loud voices and massive bags, jostling and barging. No, not all of them, he corrected himself, because in the wake of the gobby ones shoving and yelling, he noticed some quieter kids with their heads down, plugged into music, detaching themselves from the boiling teenage mass as it thundered along. He suspected his nephew Ethan might be part of the latter grouping. He remembered it well from his own secondary school years. Parked up near the postbox, he texted Ethan now, as per their arrangement. Silver Ford Focus. Ruth Henderson's boiler aside, this was pretty much the first useful thing he had done since his sabbatical had begun, Dan realised, leaning his right arm against the window. In fact, if he was honest with himself, it was possibly the most useful thing he'd done all year. In recent months, he had felt something of a zombie, wearing the same 3 suits on rotation, taking the same tube journey each morning and evening, buying the same sandwich from the same deli when it came to lunchtime. Sometimes he would be sitting there at his desk, and he'd blink and find himself unable to remember what day of the week it was, what season even. Sometimes also he felt as if he were the only unmoving constant in the office. Around him, colleagues were getting married and having children, leaving for other jobs, taking interesting-sounding courses, planning holidays, seeking sponsorship for the marathons and charity bike rides they'd signed up to. He, meanwhile, just existed. It had been that way ever since his divorce in hindsight. When everything went to pot in your private life, it was surprisingly easy to throw yourself into work, say yes to every job, however dull it might be, and turn that into your world instead. The sabbatical had been due to change that, of course. All staff were encouraged to take one after 10 years' service to the company, and it had been the managing director herself who had told Dan, quite forcibly, that they were expecting him to take a break. It was good for staff well-being, she said. They would pay him for the time he was off. This was an incredibly generous offer that most other members of the company had been delighted to accept. There must be something he wanted to do other than work, surely. He wasn't sure at first. In fact, he floundered around in the empty desert of his imagination for quite some time. Dan wasn't the most adventurous of souls, after all. His Hammersmith flat was a mere 3 streets away from the house where he'd grown up. But then, just before Christmas, he got chatting to Tiggy, one of the secretaries, who'd recently given in her notice, planning to head off to South America in February for the trip of a lifetime. Sounds amazing, Dan said, hearing her describe her itinerary with breathless gusto. I'd love to go there. Seriously? She had peered up at him through her cat-eye glasses, then smiled with a sudden new radiance. Why don't you come too, then? My travel buddy's just dropped out, the selfish cow. It won't be as much fun on my own. And aren't you meant to be taking 3 months off? Tiggy was 10 years younger than Dan. She was outspoken and sarcastic, and had a pink streak in her hair. In short, she was not the sort of travelling companion he would have picked for himself. And yet, was it idiotic that he had felt unable to refuse? His polite attempts at deferral were deflected by her increasingly persuasive line of reasoning. Yeah, but you said yourself it sounded amazing and you'd love to go there. This is your chance. Look, it's all sorted, you just need to book your flights. Remember how shit it is in this country in February? Like the worst, right? Well, forget that, because you could be on a beach instead, drinking cocktails, learning to surf and scuba dive. Apparently there's a wicked place you can dive at Easter Island. Nobody was more astonished than Dan when, by the end of a 15-minute coffee break, he'd actually said okay. He'd think about it. It was partly the fact that Tiggy was so relentless and enthusiastic, but also partly because he kept eyeing this version of himself that went off and did exciting things, like climb mountains and scuba dive, and rather liked it. Besides, she was right about February. He'd always found it the most miserable month of the year, too. Blimey, you must really fancy her, Patrick teased the following weekend, when Dan mentioned that he was considering taking this mad, impulsive trip with a colleague he barely knew. Dan had protested. Tiggy was so not his type. The idea was laughable. But the more he thought about getting on a plane and exploring cities and jungles and ancient temples and beaches, the more he was seduced by the idea of an adventure. Why not? He had never done anything like this before. Never been the reckless type. Never even been particularly brave. Since his divorce, his life had shrunk to a narrow tunnel, all safety and routine. Earning plenty, but never spending it. The thought of breaking out of his comfort zone and striding towards a new horizon, well, it appealed greatly, actually. Did he dare? Yes, he dared. Encouraged by Tiggy, badgered by Tiggy, some would say, he dared. He'd be 40 in the autumn, and this could be his chance to finally do something extraordinary, And think how impressed, and maybe even jealous, Rebecca would be if she got to hear about him gallivanting to a whole new hemisphere with another woman. A younger, cooler woman. She'd always nagged him about being too closed off, too cautious. But you could hardly get less closed off and cautious than travelling to the other side of the world, right? Okay, he told Tiggy the following Monday at work. He even sounded quite breezy about it, he reflected, thrilled by his own boldness. I'll join you. And so the plan had come together. A 3-month tour, all carefully researched and mapped out. Obviously, there were spreadsheets. He had downloaded guidebooks and traveller's tips. He had worked as hard on his itinerary as he had done on his MBA. They established a few ground rules too, or rather, Tiggy had laid down the law. Just to make this clear, 1, no sex, she said, tapping a pen against her teeth. Of course, blustered Dan, caught between wanting to agree vehemently, which might insult her, and not agreeing hard enough and possibly creeping her out. His whole face remained hot as she went through her other stipulations. 2, they could go their own separate ways at any time. 3, Actually, he had stopped listening by then, because he was still so mortified by the no-sex rule. He didn't even fancy her, and yet now he was left feeling like some dirty old pervert. To cut a long story short, he hadn't gone to South America. He'd been a week away from getting on the plane, from becoming that man, when Patrick's body was found, at which point the world had telescoped right back down to its narrow boundaries once more. You should still go, his parents had urged him. But of course, in the shock and tumult of the aftermath, Dan hadn't felt able to. And yet, well, this might sound risible, but in some ways it had been a relief to cancel the trip, now that he had an excuse not to go. A relief, because although he hadn't said this aloud to anyone, he'd been kind of nervous about spending so much time out of the safe bubble of his usual routine. He'd been increasingly nervous about spending so much time with Tiggy as well. The more he'd got to know her, the more he'd realised how different they were, personality-wise. She would probably want to go to wild parties and snort drugs off beefy Brazilian men's chests all the time, whereas he wouldn't. He would only have been a disappointment to her ultimately. A weight dragging her down. You what? Oh, man. Tiggy sighed when he rang to tell her that he was no longer going, choking on the words in his shock and grief as he explained why. Shit, Dan. So sorry to hear that. I'm gutted for you about the trip too. But look, leave it a month and come out when you feel like it, yeah? It would probably do you good to get right away from everything. Yeah? Yeah, he had replied dully. But he knew even then that he wouldn't. His trip had already vanished like a mirage, a vivid dream that he couldn't clutch onto. He'd had a postcard from her that morning, in fact, from Valparaiso. Wish you were here, she'd written, and it hardly seemed real that in another universe he would have been there too. Anyway, whatever. Here he was now instead, doing something practical at least, punctual and ready to commit himself to the first uncle-nephew bonding session of the new post-Patrick world. Zoe had texted him the address earlier and Dan had felt a jolt of, nostalgia? Heartache? As he realised where the sculpt shed was located, 2 streets from the road where he and Rebecca had rented their first flat together. Back in the good old days of optimism and love. Mind you, in hindsight, their differences had been apparent even then. She liked to stay in bed for hours at the weekend. He didn't. She liked friends dropping round any time of day or night. He didn't. She didn't care how the dishwasher was stacked, while he knew for a fact that his way was more efficient. They had teased each other for these things, though, and none of them had really mattered until, years later and married, they all suddenly mattered. Mattered too much for her to want to be with him anymore, apparently. Enough about Rebecca, he told himself. He needed to stop looking back over his shoulder and face forward again. Today was all about being positive, taking another step to redress the balance and put things right. Forget his travel plans. Dan intended to devote the remaining 2 months of his sabbatical to filling in for his brother. He couldn't bring him back, but he could walk in his shoes when possible, blot up some of the pain caused by Patrick's absence by being the very best replacement he could. True to form, he had already drawn up a spreadsheet over the weekend to track his progress. The Patrick Plan, Dan had titled the document, and as soon as he'd printed it out, he felt more in control, as if he had a purpose again. If he could complete at least one task that Patrick would have done for his family and business every single day, he would help ease the burden all round, he'd figured. It was now almost the end of March, and he wasn't due back at work again until early June. Just think what he could achieve in that time. And maybe by then they might all have navigated their way collectively into the second phase of the bereavement at least, the shock and devastation having begun to lift. The spreadsheet was now pinned up on Dan's fridge. He was trying not to think about how it resembled all the sticker-based reward charts that Patrick and Zoe had used with the kids to encourage good behaviour. He tried also to block out Patrick's voice in his head, teasing him for his methodology. Life isn't a spreadsheet, Dan. You can't fit people into boxes and charts. To which Dan found himself replying, each to his own. He had never before come across a spreadsheet that had let him down. At the top of the page, he'd listed all the best things about his brother that he wanted to emulate. A great dad, a loving husband, a successful businessman, and so on. Then, in neat typed columns below, he had thought up a number of ways in which he could try to fill in the gaps Patrick had left. So far, these included time with Ethan, lifts to and from his sculpt shed group every week. They could chat each way, man and boy stuff that Ethan couldn't tell Zoe about. Maybe stop for a sneaky burger on the way back sometimes, to cement the bonding. Ethan could confide in him, lean on him as a substitute father figure. Or so Dan hoped. Time with Gabe. Dan was less clear on what this might entail, although he sensed his younger nephew would prefer it to be something exciting and possibly dangerous, or football-related. They could watch the occasional Fulham match together, like Gabe had with Patrick. Go mountain biking maybe, or find some other adrenaline-charged activity. Time with B. He had even fewer ideas how he might fulfill this category, but he'd assured Zoe that he was up for it, whatever his small niece might want to do. If she needed chaperoning to dance lessons or an afternoon doing arts and crafts together or... He bit his lip, already out of suggestions. See, this was why he needed to put in the effort, he told himself. Get to know his own relatives again, like a proper uncle. Also on the list, being there for Zoe. This was similarly hard to quantify, but he would endeavour to help out whenever needed, although he would have to take care in his approach. He cringed, remembering how she had given him the side-eye on Sunday when he offered to mow the lawn. I can use a lawnmower, Dan. I'm not completely clueless, she'd scoffed in reply. Besides, the grass hasn't really got going yet this spring. It's been so cold. And aren't you meant to let lawns grow a bit longer anyway these days, for wildlife reasons? He'd had to back off. Message received that his suggestion had been clumsy. But then she'd added, You can do the hoovering, though, if you're desperate to save me from the rising tide of chores. Thus pointedly notifying him of his gendered ideas of help. Had he been patronising? He wondered glumly to himself, heaving the battered red Henry around the living room floor moments later. He prided himself on being modern and switched on, in terms of equality, but he'd immediately leapt straight to old-fashioned ideas about men's jobs and women's jobs, and Zoe had rightfully called him out for it. He would keep working on that, though. Maybe he could... He jumped as the car door opened in the next moment, and there was Ethan, hunching awkwardly to peer inside. Hi, he said. Hello, mate. Had a good day? Hop in. Dan said, starting the engine as Ethan detached a weighty-looking backpack from his shoulders and clambered into the passenger seat. They set off into the school-run traffic, which was fulsome and slow-moving. A weak, irritating drizzle freckled the windscreen as they headed towards the A3. "So, how was your day?" Dan asked. "I care," he wanted his nephew to hear. "I'm interested. I care so much I have typed up an entire list of ways I'm going to atone for your dad's death, and I've pinned it up on my fridge. Okay?" No, he probably shouldn't say that out loud, but all the same, he was determined to show that he was in it for the long haul. "What lessons did you have today, then?" "Crap ones," Ethan replied, looking completely uninterested. Said Dan, wondering if he should comment on his nephew's language, but unwilling to start wielding joyless authority so early on. He wanted to be the cool, friendly uncle rather than priggish twerp after all. He braked at a pedestrian crossing and they watched as an elderly man swung himself across on a pair of crutches, seemingly risking his balance by putting up a hand in thanks. "So, what are the non-crap lessons then? Are there any non-crap lessons?" Dan asked, raising his own hand at the old man in return. No rush, then glancing back at Ethan, who shrugged. To be fair, he'd probably have given the same response at that age. Daniel shows promise but never quite manages to apply himself. That had been the recurrent theme of his school reports. Come to think of it, that had pretty much been the recurrent theme of his entire life. "How's your week going, then?" he asked rather lamely, to which Ethan lifted a shoulder and mumbled, "All right," without divulging any other details. Right, this wasn't going to be as easy as he'd hoped. After a full day at school and in the unfamiliar surroundings of his uncle's car, perhaps it wasn't surprising that Ethan didn't seem ready for any instant bonding or confiding. "I'll put some music on," Dan said as the silence stretched thickly between them. He switched on the radio, feeling like a failure as 5 Live obligingly filled the void with sports commentary. "Are you interested in athletics? Find a music channel if you want," he added, changing gear as he approached a roundabout. For a moment, he thought Ethan was going to ignore him, but then the boy took his phone out of his blazer pocket. "Or I could link my phone to your Bluetooth. Play something from that," he suggested. "What? Yeah, sure. Whatever. You can educate me." He felt a burst of intrigue as Ethan fiddled around, linking the devices together. What would he choose to play? Some bratty teen pop? He couldn't imagine it somehow. Death metal? Unlikely. In the next moment, however, thunderous piano chords burst from the speakers, fast and furious. "Beethoven," Ethan said, turning up the volume a little. Okay, so he hadn't been expecting that. Dan was an ignoramus when it came to classical music. He preferred something with a chorus that you could sing along to, a beat you could hammer out on a steering wheel when stuck in traffic. All the same, he was able to feel the urgency of the music, the tempo so frenetic you could hardly imagine how anyone's fingers could gallop across the keys so quickly. The air swelled with a crescendo. "Wow," he said. "You're into this then, I take it? Do you play yourself?" "No," said Ethan. "I just like it." They drove along, listening to the rippling movement of the piece. Ethan with his eyes shut, Dan thinking back to the box of paperwork he'd picked up from Zoe, promising to sort it out. She'd given him Patrick's work phone too, which was full of unanswered messages and unlistened to phone calls. "Would you mind? It's just been one thing after another," she had said apologetically, but Dan had been only too willing to take it off her hands, not least because it was another task that he could add to his secret plan up on the fridge. Clearly, he was not going to be undertaking any building work or dishing out quotes to people who had requested it, but he was pretty sure he could deal with Patrick's tenants for the time being. How hard could it be, after all? Chances were he wouldn't hear much from them anyway, he'd figured. So far, he had at least been able to delete the increasingly desperate calls from Mrs. Henderson regarding her boiler. But there were others that needed attention. The family in Shepherd's Bush whose back door had been kicked in by a would-be burglar and now wouldn't lock properly. A man giving notice on his flat in Acton. And an elderly-sounding woman. It's Rosemary, darling, who'd said she'd heard a mouse several times now, and could he pop round? Dan had phoned them all back, feeling a stab of alarm when he realised that darling Rosemary's number was stored on his brother's phone as pain in arse. Having booked an emergency locksmith to go out to the Shepherd's Bush flat as soon as possible, he was also faced with the slightly more onerous task of dropping round to the so-called pain in arse tomorrow morning. "Hey, did your dad ever mention one of his tenants called Rosemary?" he asked Ethan now, curious. He had to raise his voice to be heard over the music, which seemed to be whirling up into an all-guns-blazing ending. "Rosemary? Yeah, all the time. Moaniest old cow he'd ever met," Ethan replied. Uncle Dan, we've missed the turn-in. We should have gone left then." "Whoops, sorry, not concentrating," he said, swinging round at the next junction and doubling back. He'd been heading for his old address on automatic pilot, he realised. The memories of all those journeys mapped into his brain on a deep cellular level, clicking straight back in again, as if he'd never been away. You could take the bloke out of Wandsworth, as they said. Sculpt Shed, when they eventually arrived, looked pretty unimposing from the outside, resembling a characterless industrial unit with big metal shutters, set in a no-through road not far from the high street. Nonetheless, Dan could hear hip-hop music breezing out from an open window, the screech of what sounded like an angle grinder, as well as shouts of laughter. I couldn't help feeling intrigued. "Do I need to come in and make sure you're—" he started asking. But Ethan edged away, shaking his head and saying, "No, it's cool, I'm fine from here. Thanks." In other words, on your bike now, old person. Don't go showing me up in front of my arty mates. "Understood. I'll meet you back at the car afterwards," Dan replied, walking away. He had 90 minutes to kill now, and nothing to do. This was the problem with taking a 3-month sabbatical to go travelling and then never actually going because your brother had died. The days tended to mock you with their emptiness. He'd worked out last night that, had things been different, he and Tiggy would have been on their way to Argentina by this point, which had prompted a sorrowful few minutes forlornly imagining another version of himself, hiking to see the Perito Moreno glacier or eating an amazing steak in Buenos Aires. Never mind. Dan's midlife crisis. Patrick had teased him in the pub that last night, when Dan had shown him pictures of the salt flats in Bolivia that he was looking forward to seeing, and described his plan for hiking the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu. "Jealous much?" Dan had retaliated, only to see a glimmer of what looked like resentment on his brother's face. Yeah, Patrick was jealous. For once, Dan was doing something that Patrick had never done. For once, having the family and business and nice house looked kind of pedestrian and safe in comparison to Dan's big old adventure right there on the horizon. Not that Patrick would ever have admitted as much, of course. "What, jealous of you? No chance," he'd scoffed instead. Whatever. It was academic now anyway, because Dan had never even made it to Heathrow, and Patrick had sidestepped the whole jealousy issue by dying like that. He always had to go one better, didn't he? Always had to have the last word. Dan stared down at the pavement as he walked blindly along, because he would have given anything to have Patrick back for some brotherly mick-taking in the pub again, even if the conversation had descended into something altogether darker by the end of the night. But there was no chance of that ever happening again. What a waste. Without being aware of it, Dan had walked to the street where he and Rebecca had once lived together all those years ago. and he gave a start as he realised where his feet had taken him. Ground floor flat, 21 Windermere Road. Good times. He remembered what a dump it had been initially, a cheap dump, with a horrible avocado green loo and sink in the bathroom, and the smell of mildew in the tiny kitchen. The cushions on the brown corduroy sofa had been torn and were prone to leaking sad little clouds of stuffing, while the bedroom carpet sported what looked like a massive bloodstain in the middle. But over time it had become a cosy nest, their nest, which they repainted and decorated and made homely. Rebecca's red mirror-work Indian throw had transformed the sofa, and a rug from Camden Market had hidden the dodgy stains of the bedroom carpet. The kitchen was brightened up with framed pop-art prints and cacti on the windowsill. They bought retro lampshades and cushions and stuck a big map of the world above the mantelpiece, with colourful drawing pins pushed into all the places they wanted to explore. Standing in front of the house now, he half expected to see a spectral version of himself shimmering there, striding up the path and letting himself in. The happy old Dan who smiled at strangers, who was in love with his beautiful girlfriend, who had big plans for the future and no idea that in years to come she'd get an eye-popping promotion at work and move into a new circle of confident, charismatic friends. By then they'd taken the plunge and bought a fancier place in Clapham, and he quickly began to feel left behind, as if he disappointed her. "Can't you try a bit harder?" she'd asked him once, exasperated when he'd accompanied her to a glamorous work-do at Gibson Hall and found his small talk to be lacking. He'd felt shy, out of his depth, while she cruised through the crowds with ease, pulling away from him in more ways than one. The irritating drizzle had now turned into a more determined pattering shower. As the raindrops began soaking his hair and sliding beneath his collar, Dan swerved away from the building, heading back along the wet pavement and ducking into the nearest pub. Their former local, except that it had been transformed since its old man and his dog days of tobacco-coloured walls and sticky carpets. Nowadays it was a smart gastropub with tasteful claret paintwork and flagstone flooring. Everything changed while you looked the other way, he thought, walking up to the bar and ordering a coffee. The pub was quiet, and Dan was able to sit by the window gazing out at the buses trundling down the high street. The school uniform-clad teenagers on their bikes apparently unbothered by the rain, shoppers with umbrellas, people walking along staring at their phones. He pulled out his own phone for something to do and opened Facebook for the first time in weeks. There were several photos posted by Tiggy, most of which seemed to be variations on a theme. Her sandwiched between two bronzed, buff and oiled men on a beach, and he snorted faintly with a mixture of affection and regret. There were still loads of unopened condolence messages about Patrick that he hadn't been able to face reading properly or replying to, including... Oh, God. He actually flinched as he saw her name there, including one from Rebecca herself. "Speak of the devil and she will appear." Before he could think better of it, he clicked on the message. "Devastated to hear the news about Patrick," she had typed a fortnight ago. "He was always so full of life. Thinking about you and the family." His jaw tightened and he had to put the phone down quickly because a flood of emotions threatened to overwhelm him. So many feelings. Too many feelings. "Don't think about it," he ordered himself. "Don't think about her." He'd become so adept at blocking out painful thoughts in the last month, like a blanket thrown over a birdcage. He hadn't so much as peeked beneath it. But today... Maybe it was having just been back to Windermere Road, feeling the past put its hand on his shoulder. But it wasn't so easy today. Suddenly, he found himself clicking through to Rebecca's page, needing to know what she was doing with her life. They had split up 3 years ago, and although Dan had steadfastly avoided finding out too much about her since then, He'd been unable to miss the headline fact of her remarriage last summer to some broad-shouldered alpha male called Rory. At the time, Dan had only been able to bear a few glances at the photos. But Rory looked the sort of man who flew helicopters for fun and saved children's lives in between sealing massive global deals during office hours. He definitely would have one of those massive, expensive watches, if he could find one big enough to go around his thick, strong wrist, of course. "It's okay, I don't care. I'm over her too," Dan had declared to anyone who would listen during an 8-pint bender on her wedding day, shortly before everything got really messy and blurry. He glanced at the screen again now and saw that her most recent update was a cryptic one. "Big day tomorrow. Cross your fingers for me." Ugh, he thought, closing the app immediately. She was probably having an interview for CEO of the world this time, for even more money and status. Amazing celebratory holidays with Rory and all their high-flying friends. His face burned as he felt rejected all over again. He certainly wouldn't be crossing anything for her, he thought. Outside, the shower had already eased off, and the pavement glinted damply as the sun sent tentative rays slicing through the pigeon-grey clouds. A bus had to brake hard at a distracted cyclist, issuing a disapproving honk, while a cluster of women with prams walked along together, all wearing lycra and enormous colourful trainers, their ponytails swinging behind them in unison. Then Dan realised that Patrick's work phone was ringing from his jacket pocket, and scrabbled to pull it out. "Pain in arse," read the screen, and he let out a muffled groan. Sometimes he couldn't help thinking the universe had it in for him. "So, how did you get on? What were you making today?" Coffee finished, a demanding tenant temporarily placated, and all thoughts of Rebecca firmly stashed back in a mental folder marked "Do Not Disturb." Dan and Ethan were heading back towards Kew. As before, though, the conversation, like the traffic, was not exactly flowing freely, although another furious concerto currently thundered from the speakers. "It's a group project," Ethan said, all shrugs and mumbles. "Of..." "Come on, kid. Give me something to work with here," Dan thought, trying not to sigh as he turned up the fan heater. Ethan had seemed so pleased on Friday when Dan had offered him a lift. What had changed since then? "It's a person, made of metal," Ethan replied, as if long sentences were beyond him. Even his body language seemed closed off, unwilling, Dan thought, glancing across. The boy's knees were turned towards the door, away from Dan, as if he didn't want to look at his uncle. Had something happened at the club? Was someone picking on him, maybe, or giving him a hard time? "Everything all right?" he asked, as they joined the South Circular, along with half the vehicles in the capital, by the look of things. It was a stupid question, he realised, as soon as the words were out of his mouth. Of course Ethan wasn't all right. When would Dan remember to stop relying on such inappropriate and banal conversational prompts? "Listen, I know no one will ever take the place of your dad," he said. "But you can talk to me, okay? Think of me as, I don't know, as a substitute for him, yeah?" Dan had to overtake a van in the next moment, so couldn't be entirely sure, but he thought Ethan might have muttered, "puts the tit in substitute," or something along those lines. Startled, Dan looked over at him again. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Just say it, whatever it is." There was a loaded pause. "It's about when Dad died," the boy eventually mumbled, looking down at his own hands. "Ah, shit. They were going there, were they?" "What about it?" Dan asked, feeling as if he had stepped onto a tightrope. "Don't look down. Keep breathing. Baby steps." "I heard Mum saying, Well, nobody's really explained what happened, Ethan said, the words tumbling out in a rush. His usually pale face flushed and a hard edge appeared in his voice. And I heard Mum say that she blamed you, basically, for Dad dying. She said it was your fault. And I just wondered, was it? Is there something I don't know? His hands curled into fists. Because I need to know, he finished gruffly. Dan's mouth was dry suddenly. If Patrick could see his boy here now, fierce and brave, asking this really tough question of his uncle, he would be so proud of him, Dan thought with a pang. But in the meantime, what was he supposed to say in reply? Moreover, why did they have to launch into such a difficult conversation on the heaving South Circular, where he was stop-starting along in first gear? It was an accident, he began. Your dad. Then he hesitated, wary of saying too much. What did your mum tell you about that night? That he fell into the river and drowned. Yes. Up floated Patrick's body from Dan's nightmares, pale and bloated, eyes half-eaten by the fish, weeds streaking his dark hair. He hadn't actually seen Patrick on the mortuary slab himself. It had been poor Zoe who had gone to identify the body. But his imagination had filled in the gaps with vivid enough detail. That's what happened. Unfortunately. So, why does she think it was your fault? Ethan's knee was jiggling with the stress of the conversation, his voice low but tense. Fists still clenched on the knees of his school trousers, as if poised to start raining vengeful blows at any moment. You didn't push him in, did you? No. Christ, is that what you've been thinking? No, absolutely not. I didn't push him in. I wasn't even there. Ethan's shoulders went limp as he exhaled audibly. Right, he said. Sorry, but why does Mum think... Because... Now they were getting to the nitty-gritty. Because he was supposed to be staying at my place that evening, not walking home on his own. Ethan took a moment to digest this. Uncle not a murderer. No need for filial vengeance. Stand down. Wait, though. Another question. So why didn't he? Stay at your place, And here it was. The very point Dan's conscience had been grappling with again and again, endlessly every bloody day, since Patrick had disappeared. Because... Bile rose in his throat, and he forced himself to remember the scene, the two of them stumbling out of the pub worse for wear, Dan angrily striding ahead, telling Patrick he should go home because he wasn't welcome, he didn't want to see him. How his brother had shrugged and walked away, leaving Dan bristling all over with impotent rage. Typical. Patrick couldn't even argue properly, just when Dan really needed to have it out with him. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel as he tried to find adequate words in reply to Ethan's question. We had an argument, he mumbled eventually. The same weak line he'd bleated to Zoe, to his parents, to everyone else who'd asked. You know the way that brothers do. Things got said in the heat of the moment. He risked a look at Ethan, whose expression was tight and pinched, hard to read. He didn't look won over by his uncle's defence, that was for sure, although the brothers bit would surely have struck a chord. Look, I wish to God I could change things, rewind that evening and do it all differently. But I can't, he said, the words bursting out with unexpected earnestness. But it was nobody's fault. Just one of those terrible, unlucky things that happens. The music had reached a crescendo, fittingly enough. Ethan said nothing. Dan was pretty sure he didn't care about luck or whose fault it was. He only cared that he no longer had a dad, that his world had been shattered one dreadful February night. "I will make this better," Dan vowed to his nephew in his head. "I promise you, I will never stop trying to make this better for you, for the rest of my life and yours." Chapter 6. The following morning, Zoe scrolled idly through a news website on her phone as she sat in the doctor's waiting room. Yet another sleepless night, and she was starting to feel as if she was losing the grip on her sanity. Her eyes were sore, her brain jangled, her entire body felt heavy and cumbersome. She was fantasizing about sleeping pills that would knock her out, send her into oblivion. "I need help," she imagined saying to the doctor when it was finally her turn to be seen. "I can't go on like this. A few days ago I burst into tears on the pavement and had to be rescued by a kind shopkeeper. What can I do? When will I start feeling normal again?" She hoped she wouldn't embarrass herself by crying, but she couldn't rule it out. Her tear duct seemed permanently on standby these days, always ready for an impromptu weep. "Do you want me to come over at the weekend?" her mum had asked on the phone last night, sounding anxious, as Zoe poured her heart out. God, it was tempting to say yes. There was a part of her that longed to retreat into the sanctuary of her mother's arms very much, to hide her face against her, like she'd done as a little girl, prone to shyness. But she'd said a regretful no in the end. She had to manage, for the sake of the children, take charge of the situation rather than ducking responsibility. Besides, if she leaned too hard on her mum, she might never be able to get up again. "Mary O'Connor," she heard a woman saying at the reception desk just then, and turned her head to see a mum she knew from school standing there. Oh, great. Now, no doubt there would be a sympathetic, "How are you?" conversation, and Zoe would not be able to reach the end of the first sentence without losing her dignity. She bent over her phone, hoping Mary wouldn't notice her in the corner, praying that she would be called in for her appointment now to avoid any awkwardness. She heard Mary's footsteps and smelled her strong jasmine perfume, but no such "how are you" was forthcoming. Glancing across the small room, she was just in time to see the other woman notice her and quickly turn her head away. Zoe felt her hackles rise. This happened a lot. People pretending they hadn't seen her because they felt uncomfortable around a grieving widow. And in many ways it was even worse than the irritating "how are yous." And guess what? She felt pretty bloody uncomfortable every minute of the day. "It's only because they don't know what to say," Claire had soothed when Zoe moaned to her about it. "And there is nothing good to say, really, other than, 'I'm so sorry this has happened to you. How can I help?' So why don't they say that then, rather than crossing the road to avoid me, as if I'm some kind of plague victim? Like I won't notice them slinking away? The cowards." She was sick of people shunning her out of their own weakness. Okay, so 10 seconds ago she might not have wanted any kind of conversation, but now, contrarily, she felt compelled to force one. "Hi, Mary," she said pointedly across the busy waiting room. "I see you." Mary looked up at once, guilt all over her face. She had strawberry blonde hair and the porcelain sort of skin that showed up even a faint blush in full fiery technicolor. "Sorry, I was miles away," she said, which was such a transparent lie that Zoe had to struggle to hold back her sardonic snort. "How are you? We all miss Patrick so much." "Zoe Shepherd," called the doctor just then, appearing in the doorway, thank God. "Bye, Mary," said Zoe, getting up from her seat and walking away, her nerve ends bristling. We all miss Patrick so much, indeed, she thought crossly. It was Mary's husband, John, who'd been friends with Patrick, not Mary, who barely even knew him. Some people simply love to cash in on another person's unhappiness, though, and appropriate it as their own. She had a sudden flash of memory from the funeral. Mary sobbing there at the back of the church, thin and beautiful in her black mourning dress. How dare she, Zoe thought now, following the doctor into her room and sitting down, shedding those fake tears, which were not even rightfully hers to shed. Dr. Gupta looked at Zoe's notes on the computer, then back at Zoe. Here came that professional compassion, thought Zoe, noting the doctor's tilted head and concerned gaze. Any second now. So, Zoe, how are you? Said Dr. Gupta. Bingo. How can I help you today? There. Can you hear it? Just there. Over in Shepherd's Bush, Dan had, with some trepidation, gone to see Rosemary, the 80-something-year-old woman who had been the bane of his brother's life by all accounts. Having expected to be confronted with a sour-faced old Gorgon in her lair, he had been surprised at the small, rather sweet-looking lady who answered the door, dressed in a crisply ironed ivory blouse with a tweedy skirt, tendrils of long white hair spilling from a chignon. Her lipstick was immaculate, and he could detect a faint floral perfume from her as she walked across the living room. "Do you hear it?" she asked as he followed her. "The mouse?" Mrs. He had forgotten her last name. He definitely mustn't call her Mrs. Pain in Arse. "Rosemary, if I may," he went on. "I think it's a squeaky floorboard rather than a mouse." He moved his foot up and down on the salmon-pink rug, demonstrating. "See?" She crossed her arms across her narrow frame, and for a moment he thought she was going to put up an argument. She had been absolutely insistent on the phone that there was a rodent problem. But then her shoulders sagged and she looked down at the carpet. "Oh. I can see why you thought it was a mouse," he said quickly, not wanting her to feel embarrassed. "It's a very mousy sort of squeak." He pressed his toe down again, nodding at the sound. "I suppose it'll mean the carpet coming up," Rosemary said, pursing her lips. Was it Dan's imagination, or did she seem pleased at the prospect? "You'll want to fix it, won't you? I mean, in case it gets worse." Replied Dan, who didn't really see the point of going to so much trouble for a squeaky floorboard. "Well, I'm not sure it's an emergency, but—" "I'll put the kettle on," she told him, whisking away before he could complete his sentence. "While you're here, you can look at the kitchen sink. There was a funny smell coming from it the other day." So much for this being a quick visit, Dan thought. An hour or so later, having drunk 2 coffees and repeatedly refused a 3rd slice of fruitcake.
This is the end of CD2. The book continues on CD3. CD3.
As soon as he fixed, or discounted, one problem, another would mysteriously arise. "Oh, you are clever," she praised him when he changed the light bulb of her bedside lamp. "Thank you, dear," she cried in apparent delight when he replaced the washer on the bathroom tap. And then, just as he was standing up to go, no, really, he absolutely had to leave now, she caught him off guard by saying, "So, where's Patrick anyway? Not that I'm complaining. You're much nicer. But is he on holiday or something?" Poleaxed, Dan sank back into his chair. He'd assumed she already knew. "Oh," he said, swallowing hard. It felt as if there was a sticky paste of fruitcake behind his teeth, gumming up his entire mouth. "He died," he managed to say. "I'm his brother. Sorry, I thought I'd said. He ran his hand through his hair. I've lost track of who knows, and... She froze, aghast at her own faux pas, and they both sat there for a moment looking at one another. Goodness gracious, she said eventually, her eyes widening in sympathy. I'm very sorry. How did he... you don't have to tell me, of course, but... Was it sudden? It must have been. I only saw him, last month. I did wonder why he wasn't answering my calls, but thought he might be on holiday, or perhaps he'd lost his phone, or... Good heavens. What happened? That question again. Twice in 2 days. Dan thought of Ethan's guarded face, the tension shown by his knotted fingers, his clenched body language. Still, Dan wasn't obliged to disclose anything to Patrick's tenant in the way that he had to Patrick's son. It was a tragic accident, he told Rosemary, not meeting her eye. He pushed his chair back and got to his feet. Very sad. Now, if you'll excuse me, I really do need to. And him a family man, too, she exclaimed, her hand flying up to her mouth. I'm very sorry to hear this news, Daniel. Very sorry indeed. Patrick's been extremely good to me over the years. Very fair. Had a bit of a temper on him now and then, obviously, but... She checked herself. Don't speak ill of the dead now. You must all be devastated. His poor children, and his parents. How terrible to lose a child. They must be heartbroken. Dan swallowed, thinking about his mum sobbing at the funeral while his dad remained dry-eyed, the twisting of a checked handkerchief between his fingers the only sign of his agitation. Yes, he mumbled. And you said it was an accident, did you? What sort of accident? Dan tried to wrestle back a grip on the conversation. If you don't mind, he said, I'd rather not talk about it. And thank goodness, that seemed to do the trick. Before she could ask him anything else, he walked to the door, although she got up immediately to follow him. A vision flashed into his head of him trying to leave the premises with Rosemary clinging to his legs to stop him, the questions ongoing. Thanks for the coffee, he said, making it all the way down the hall without being rugby tackled. Nice to meet you. See you soon, she called as he made his escape. Not if I can help it, he thought. He put up his hand and kept walking, quickly before a lasso could be used to haul him back again. The rest of Dan's week turned out to be unexpectedly busy. His long empty days spent lying in bed were a thing of the past, now that he was working through all the outstanding problems Patrick's tenants had raised recently. New locks were put in place for the family on Adelaide Grove. A leaving date was agreed with the Whitecliffe Road guy, who was moving out. A meeting arranged with the lettings agent Patrick had dealt with about advertising the soon-to-be vacant property. Although Dan had vowed to step into his brother's shoes for the duration of the sabbatical, it felt as if he was literally following in Patrick's footsteps by taking on his work this way. What was more, he felt as if his sabbatical had been invigorated, saved from the jaws of defeat and reconfigured with new purpose. With tenants to look after and his good deeds plan in place, he was out every day, dealing with all sorts of people, having to find practical solutions to a wide variety of problems. It was surprisingly enjoyable. A change is as good as a holiday, his mum had always said, and he was starting to see the wisdom in this. Admittedly, the paperwork was proving less fun to tackle, namely because Patrick didn't seem to have any sort of system as far as Dan could tell. He'd set up direct debits for the basics at least, gas, water, electricity and council tax. But there were also plumbers and electricians and locksmiths to pay, some of whom had taken to sending irate reminders. Having dealt with all the bills due that he could find, Dan noticed an emailed reminder from Patrick's accountant about the January to March quarterly VAT return documents, needing to be sent in at the end of this month, and decided he should probably start gathering together the invoices and receipts required. It was while he was working through the bank statements, item by item, that he noticed one payment for which there was no corresponding paper trail. A monthly payment of several £100s to an L. Fox, marked with the reference maintenance. A builder, kept on a retainer, he wondered? A painter and decorator? Cleaning service? It was odd because, aside from this particular payee, the other listed outgoings were fairly obvious. They were labelled receipts for a variety of goods and services: a carpenter, a plasterer, a carpet firm, 2 bottles of drain cleaner, petrol. Also, the general maintenance, boilers and broken locks and squeaky floorboards, seemed always to have fallen to Patrick himself, if the phone calls Dan had been receiving were anything to go by. Perplexed, he turned to Patrick's laptop and tracked down a file labelled Accounts, where he scrolled through old spreadsheets to see if any further information was available. The payment went out on the 1st of every month and had been listed within a column marked General, which didn't help enormously. Still curious, he went further back through the files. Whoever was receiving these monthly payments had been doing so for years, he noticed, his pulse quickening. But where was the money going? His imagination went into overdrive. Had Patrick been involved in a money laundering scheme, funneling funds through his business account to a dodgy person or company? He wrinkled his nose, unable to quite believe this scenario. Patrick was the sort of bloke who would cut corners now and then, but Dan was pretty sure he was not an out-and-out crook. Maybe he was being blackmailed then. But by whom? Did Zoe know about this? Something about it definitely smelled odd, he thought, continuing to scroll down. There didn't seem to be any paperwork to back up the maintenance service. No company invoices or correspondence whatsoever. How had Patrick even got this past the accountant? Then he eventually reached a spreadsheet dating back 7.5 years and noticed that the payment hadn't been made then. Okay. So the mysterious transfer had been leaving Patrick's business bank account for 7 years and 3 months. The question was, should Dan pursue this little mystery or turn a blind eye? If Patrick had been in some kind of trouble or collusion, and Zoe was oblivious, Dan certainly didn't want to get her involved in any extra drama. But all the same, seeing as he was sorting out the VAT return, he might be held legally responsible for anything underhand that later transpired. He went back to the original email from the accountant and found a phone number. Sod it, he was going to find out what this was about for his own peace of mind, if nothing else. "Hi," he said when he got through to the right person. "I'm preparing Patrick Shepherd's VAT return and wanted to query a payment, because I can't find any corresponding paperwork. Yes, it goes out as maintenance every month. Could you let me know the payee so that I can trace—" Then he stopped midway through his own question, because it had just occurred to him that there was more than one kind of maintenance payment. One where it was for actual property maintenance, as he'd initially assumed. But there was also such a thing as a child maintenance payment, wasn't there? Which meant that... Oh my God, no. Surely not. "Her name's Lydia Fox," the accountant said. "The payee." "I see," said Dan, his voice suddenly hoarse. He didn't want to know any more. Did he? "Right, thank you." And then he hung up, a whole new and terrible picture forming in his head. Lydia Fox. Fuck. What had Patrick got himself into here? More to the point, what the hell should Dan do about it? In the early hours of the morning, Zoe felt warm breath on her neck and a small wriggling body in close proximity. She opened her eye a crack to see that Bea had crawled into bed beside her, at which point her brain caught up with the message from her nose. The faint smell of ammonia, which meant that Bea had wet her bed again. "Did you have an accident?" she murmured, shuffling round to put an arm across her daughter and wondering what time it was. "Yes," came the reply. "But don't worry, it didn't go on the toys. And I changed my pants." "Okay," said Zoe, willing herself to plunge back into sleep. This had been happening a lot recently. Most nights since Patrick had died, in fact. Everyone will get through the loss in their own ways, stated the grief booklet her GP had pressed on her. So far, Ethan's grief had manifested itself in silent withdrawal and occasional bursts of white-faced rage. Gabe's in loud, dogged arguments. Bea's through crying jags, insistence on wearing her unicorn onesie whenever possible, and wet beds. Zoe, for her part, still felt as if she were living through her own personal disaster movie, liable to be crushed by a rockfall at any given moment. Sometimes, and she wasn't proud of this, she even wished for said rockfall to hurry up and put her out of her misery. "Try a nice lavender bath before bed," Dr. Gupta had advised, apparently loath to prescribe any sleeping pills despite Zoe's request. "Make sure you're getting plenty of exercise, enough to make you physically tired by the end of the day. And how about talking to a therapist? Just to unpack your thoughts to another person on a regular basis. There's a phone number at the back of the booklet I've given you, if you want to find out more. Or, of course, I could suggest a couple of people who might be able to help." Zoe had thanked her politely, but she knew already she wouldn't bother. She didn't have the energy to start ringing round trying to organise therapy. "Come back in 2 weeks and let's see how you're doing," the doctor had said at the end. But so far Zoe hadn't got as far as booking another appointment. What was the point? Bea's breathing became deeper and slower, and she made a few sucking sounds with her open mouth. It was too dark to see much more than her outline, but Zoe could imagine her daughter's face softening and becoming slack as sleep towed her under once more. Her poor babies. So confused. So traumatised, so bereft. Even now, weeks after the event, it seemed unthinkable that Patrick was no longer there to comfort them and her, to make them laugh, to pull them together. She didn't want to share a bed with her daughter every night. She wanted her husband beside her instead. The solid, comforting mound of him under the covers. The faint sigh of his breathing as the nightly soundtrack of her life. She wished she could hold him once more, 1,000 times more, 1,000,000. That they could be pressed so tightly together that his body would leave an imprint against hers. But he was gone. She would never be able to hold him again. Other women she knew moaned about their husbands all the time. So lazy. So thoughtless, so selfish, and sure she had criticised Patrick for all of those things once in a while. Add to the list that he was reckless with money, a terrible flirt, and that he always, without fail, left his dirty clothes on the bedroom floor rather than bothering to put them in the laundry basket. But she would gladly take all of that and never complain again if she could just have him back. At least then she would get the chance to say sorry for the last fight they'd had. "Don't think about that now," she told herself hurriedly. On nights like this, when she lay awake in the dark, her thoughts almost always circled back round to the awful things she had said that final evening. as if it was her own personal purgatory, her very heavy cross to bear. She forced herself to remember instead Patrick in one of his more heroic hours. When Ethan was a tiny baby, they'd lived in a grotty first-floor flat in Ealing, and a series of nasty notes began appearing through the front door. "Tell that brat to stop crying, or I'll be over there myself to make him stop," the notes threatened, or words to that effect. Ethan was 3 months old and colicky, and yes, he did cry a lot, day and night. But Zoe was doing her best, she thought, reading the notes, ashen-faced. She went round and apologised meekly to the shrewish 50-something woman who lived next door, but the neighbour gave her short shrift. "Some of us have jobs to go to. I'll be complaining to the council if this carries on. Get a social worker onto you." Exhausted by the demands of early mothering and intimidated by the angry woman, Zoe had said nothing to Patrick. But then a few nights later, after Ethan had had a particularly grisly day, loud music came blaring through the wall around 2 a.m, startling them all and making Ethan sob with wide-eyed fright. "It's that woman again, I bet," Zoe said, trying to reassure her terrified son. "What woman?" Patrick had asked, getting out of bed. Zoe hadn't wanted to drag him into the situation, but ended up showing Patrick the notes. It was like activating a superhero, or at the very least unleashing something primitive and fundamental inside him, the genetic code of which basically came down to defend woman and child. "Right," he said, jaw set, before marching straight over there to deliver a furious riposte to their neighbour. Off went the music almost immediately, although not before Zoe heard the woman shouting, "Well, now you know what it feels like to be woken up in the night by a horrible noise. Annoying, isn't it?" Patrick, once roused, was unstoppable. He was magnificent, in fact. "How dare you?" Zoe heard him retaliate. "How dare you write your pathetic little notes to us, threatening my son and harassing my wife? I've got a good mind to call the police. Do you think you're helping at all? Making things better? Have you any idea how tired my wife is? How much we've been through recently? She lost 2 pints of blood when she gave birth. Did you know that? No. Because you didn't bother to find out. People like you make me sick, and I don't want to hear another word from you on this subject. Do you hear me? Not another word. Otherwise, God help me, I might end up doing something I regret." My hero, Zoe had thought back then as the door slammed behind him. The great protector. From the moment she'd discovered she was pregnant with Ethan, Patrick had been the most loving husband, the best dad ever. But now she had nobody. Now she was left to do everything herself. Fight her own battles and mop up her own mess. Some random guy had rung the doorbell after dark a couple of evenings ago, asking for money, to which she'd politely said no and closed the door. But afterwards, she found herself nervously listening out for his return and wishing that Patrick was there just for the security. Sometimes when she was awake in the night, like now, she heard strange noises around the house and became convinced that someone was trying to break in. By now she had worked out a plan of action: wake up the kids and lock her and them safely in the bathroom while she dialed 999. But even so, it was hardly a relaxing way to spend the wee small hours. "See? This is what I have to deal with now, because of you being stupid enough to die on me," she raged at him in her head. "Lying here wide awake, imagining the worst. Crying in the streets the other day like a crazy person." At least she had made amends on that front, she consoled herself. Earlier today, she had slunk back to the boutique where the woman had been so kind to her and pressed a bunch of velvety mauve anemones into her hand, muttering hot-faced apologies. The woman had been lovely, thank goodness, telling her there was absolutely no need to say sorry, and even scribbling down her number on a business card, in case you ever want to chat. Still, not everything was resolved, not by a long chalk. There was still the matter of what exactly had happened between Patrick and Dan that fateful night to get to the bottom of. Something that Dan was resolutely not telling her. "What were you even talking about in the pub?" she'd asked him after Patrick's death had been confirmed, when they were all groping their way through the ghastly new landscape of bereavement. She wanted to get to grips with every detail of those final known hours, examine every clue of behaviour that might explain why Patrick had gone off alone and what might have happened to him. She also felt desperate to learn what Patrick had said about her, about their argument. Did Dan know about that, for instance? It sounded as if Patrick had left the world with two of his dearest loved ones angry with him, which broke her heart to imagine. But Dan was unforthcoming, shifty even, staring at the floor, muttering that he couldn't remember all of it. They'd both drunk too much. "But you remember feeling angry enough to say that he couldn't stay at yours anymore? You remember sending him off along the river path to his death?" she'd asked sharply, only it had come out as more of a shout, a scream possibly. "Zoe, that's not helping," her mum had said, putting a calm hand on hers, but Dan hadn't replied, merely flinching, then avoiding her gaze. It had wormed away at her ever since, that downward stare of his, the way he had pulled up the drawbridge. "I can't remember." Yeah, right. It was so obvious that he could, but something was stopping him from telling her. What? Was he protecting her by not revealing whatever hateful, damning remarks Patrick had made about her? Was that why Dan had stayed away all this time? Did he now hate and blame her for his brother's drowning? God, you could go mad, spiralling down into paranoia over this, but she couldn't quite bring herself to ask the questions aloud. She did not want to be told that yes, her husband had gone to his death angry with her, resentful after their bust-up. It would finish her off, destroy what little was left of her. And now Dan had appeared at her door, wearing that penitent hangdog look all the time, and she knew he was trying to do the right thing by her, but even so, the doubts and suspicion kept surfacing. What really happened that night? What was keeping Dan so tight-lipped? One way or another, she knew she'd have to get it out of him. Just as soon as she felt strong enough to cope with any unpleasant truths. Chapter 7. On Sunday, it was Liz Shepherd's 70th birthday, and the entire family was gathering for a celebratory lunch in the Plough. The first time they'd all been together since Patrick's funeral. Dan could tell the minute he saw her that his mum had been crying because her mascara was smudged around the soft pouches of her eyes, and she was blowing her nose. "Happy birthday, Mum," he said, hugging her. "How can it be happy when my oldest son isn't with us anymore?" she gulped, and he tightened his grip about her, catching his dad's eye and exchanging a look of defeat. Was it unfair of Dan to say that he'd always felt like the second favourite son? Throughout their childhood, Patrick had consistently been the one to jump higher, kick harder, charm every person who crossed his path. Patrick was taller, better looking, funnier, more successful, whereas Dan was, well, kind of a dork, he supposed. A loser. Nobody had quite said aloud, "The wrong son died," after Patrick's death, but Dan was pretty sure his mum had thought that at some point. Even now, weeks on, she could hardly look him in the eye. "We'll make the best of it," he said after a moment. "We'll raise a glass to him. I'm sure he's looking down on you, from wherever he is." Personally, he had no truck with any notions of an afterlife, but his mum, a Catholic, was a firm believer. "And he'd want you to be happy today, wouldn't he? On your birthday." A bereaved mother on Mothering Sunday, though. Did you ever hear of anything so awful? Shit. It was Mothering Sunday too. He glanced furtively around, noticing how full the pub was, with smiling women positioned at the head of every table. There was a shiny foil balloon on the next table saying "Best Mum Ever." Yes, and a list of Mother's Day specials chalked up on the board beside the bar. Damn it. Mother's Day. How had he managed to miss that? A good excuse to celebrate what a great mum you were to him, and still are to me, he said after a brief hesitation, wondering if he would be able to unpeel the envelope containing his 70th birthday card and add an extra Mother's Day message as well. Probably not. Let me get you a drink. What would you like? She blew her nose again and blinked. Dear me, I must look a fright, she said, rummaging in her handbag for a compact mirror and powder thing. A large glass of Sauvignon Blanc, please, Daniel. She peered at her reflection as she dusted her face. Liz Shepherd had always taken care over her appearance, with her chic silvery bob, statement jewellery and smart handbags. Today, however, she looked, well, pretty unkempt actually, although she would have killed Dan for saying as much. He wasn't usually good at noticing such things, but even he could see that her hair needed cutting and her navy dress was crumpled. A very large one, if you know what I mean. 1 bucket of wine coming up, he confirmed, before remembering the spreadsheet pinned on his fridge at home. Of course. He should have factored his parents into the plan too, in an attempt to fill up the gaps Patrick's death had left in their lives. He squeezed her shoulder gently. Listen, Mum, I was wondering, is there anything that Patrick used to do for you that I could do instead? He asked. Like odd jobs or what have you? His mum sniffled, putting her compact away. We just miss him popping round, don't we, Derek? She said plaintively. Every time someone comes to the door, I think it might be him. Even now, but... Yes, agreed her husband when she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He was a taciturn man who used words with economy, as if speaking each one cost him money. Apart from when he lost his temper, of course, when he would spray them out full pelt. As a little boy, Dan had once been so frightened when his dad started shouting at his mum in the car about a wrong set of directions that he'd wet himself, the hot splash of liquid soaking through his trousers onto the vinyl back seat. He still remembered how his mum had sighed, "Oh, Daniel," at him when they eventually arrived and got out of the car, and how Patrick had instinctively put an arm around him. Popping round? He asked now. What, at the weekend or... No, during the week. He'd be driving by and he'd drop in for a cuppa. Sometimes he'd help out your dad, or he'd get me a bit of shopping if my legs were playing up, or... You know, he was just there, a lot. This was all news to Dan. Working in his glass box over in the city for long hours during the week, he had never once dropped round to see his mum and dad in this way. It hadn't occurred to him that Patrick might. Right, he said, feeling as if he'd missed something obvious. I see. Well, maybe I should start doing the same. He would do the same, he thought immediately. This very week he would manufacture an excuse to drive over to their small semi in Brentford and play a more active role in his parents' lives. In the meantime, let me get those drinks. Dad, what would you like? He escaped to the crush of sons and husbands at the bar, still mulling over the fact that he had perhaps neglected his parents in a way Patrick clearly hadn't. It was like discovering you'd missed out on a party that everyone else had been invited to, only in this case he should have thought to invite himself. Dan had always thought he knew his brother well, but here was something that he'd been unaware of. A second thing he'd been unaware of, rather, because he still hadn't been able to track down this mysterious Lydia Fox of the maintenance payments leaving Patrick's business bank account. He had searched for her through all the contacts on his brother's phone, trawled through email accounts and Facebook friends, but had found no trace. Whoever this woman was, it looked very much as if Patrick had wanted her to be kept secret. But who was she to him? There had to be some rational explanation for the payments, he kept telling himself. There must be. His imagination had provided all sorts of lurid options that he didn't want to look at too closely. Was she a mistress, tucked away in one of his flats? With Patrick paying her from his company account, as if she was some kind of business expense, some other service that was being supplied? Maintenance made him think there must be a child there too, which added a whole other layer of complexity. But no. Patrick had behaved badly in the past. Dan was trying not to dwell too closely on that. But this was getting into the realms of bonkers fantasy. Surely. "Hello, lovey. Your mum and dad sent us over," came a voice just then, and he turned to see his Auntie Mary and Uncle Colin at the bar beside him. "I'll have a small sherry if you're buying, and Colin will have... Pint of bitter, Colin?" "Please," said Colin, who was never one to disagree with his wife. If she told him he was having a Jaeger bomb or a flaming sambuca, he'd probably have nodded obediently. "I thought we would be the last ones here today. Colin couldn't find his glasses as usual, but I gather Zoe hasn't arrived yet," said Mary, with a sympathetic cluck. "It must be very hard for her, the poor thing, especially when the children are all so... Oh, here she is now." Dan looked over to see Zoe and the kids barreling through the pub door. Zoe wore her usual frazzled expression as she gazed around, simultaneously ignoring Ethan and Gabe, who were bickering furiously, as well as Bea, who was plucking at Zoe's sleeve with an urgent expression. Who was he not seeing? Dan wondered, unable to stop thinking about the maintenance payments. Another child? Another partner? What on earth had Patrick got himself into, and how much, if anything, did Zoe know? Oh dear, she's got her hands full, hasn't she? Sniffed Mary, frowning as Gabe thumped Ethan's arm. "Zoe, over here," called Dan, wondering in the next moment if the children had any idea it was Mother's Day. Damn it! If he'd known, he could have given Ethan a heads up on Wednesday, chucked him some cash to sort out cards and flowers for his mum. But if even he, an adult, hadn't been on the ball, he was pretty sure the children wouldn't have organised anything themselves. "Hi," he said, waving as they approached. "What do you all want to drink? Special Mother's Day glass of fizz, so?" By the way, what does the name Lydia Fox mean to you, Zoe? Zoe looked wan. "Just a tea, please. Kids, what would you like?" Ethan asked for a Coke. Bea, a lemonade. No, orange juice. No, actually, a fizzy apple juice. Yes, definitely that. While Gabe asked for a pint of beer and then changed it to a hot chocolate when Zoe told him off for being silly. "You do all know it's Mother's Day, right?" Dan said to the children, with a meaningful look over at Zoe. "Uh-oh," said Gabe, eyeing her. "Nope, we didn't have a clue." "I thought it was Grandma's birthday," said Bea, frowning. "Well, it's that too," said Dan, "but..." "It's fine, it's not a big deal," Zoe interrupted. "Don't start guilt-tripping them. Bea, let's find the loo. I thought you were bursting. Boys, help your uncle carry the drinks over, please." Dan opened his mouth to defend himself, then shut it again. He wasn't trying to guilt-trip anyone, he wanted to say. He was trying to be thoughtful. But she was already walking away with Bea. "Who's next?" called the bar worker then, and Dan spun round to put in the order. "Don't take any notice of Mum," Ethan said gruffly. "She's just in a bad mood today." "Yeah, we had to get the bus because the car wouldn't start, and then she said the F word," said Gabe, looking gleeful at the memory. "Well, she didn't actually say the F word. She said fuck, but—" "Gabe," Dan said warningly as his Auntie Mary started pulling her cardigan about herself, making goodness me how disgraceful faces. "Language." Then he motioned to the barman. "Sorry, mate. Could you change that pint of lager to a Coke, please?" The pub was only a 10-minute walk from his flat. If Zoe's car was playing up, he could give them all a lift back home later on, he figured. Tar. Then he took a £20 note from his wallet, handing it to Ethan. Better late than never. "Here, maybe you could pop out and get your mum something with this later on, when you're back in queue. Bunch of flowers or a box of chocolates, that sort of thing. Say it's from all of you, yeah?" Gabe's eyes went round. "Wow, 20 quid!" "Yeah, for me to look after, not you," Ethan told him, tucking it into his jeans pocket. "Thanks, Uncle Dan." One more good deed to add to his balance sheet, he thought a few minutes later, carrying the drinks over to the table. 2 good deeds if Zoe said yes to the lift home. He wondered if he would ever be able to earn enough to achieve any kind of redemption. Right now, he doubted it. Zoe had never really gone in for Mother's Day in a big way, so she'd been surprised on waking up that Sunday by how flat she felt without Patrick there, marshalling the children to bring her a tray of breakfast things, plus a vase of whatever was alive in the garden. One year she had been presented with a selection of twigs with a cake ribbon tied around them. It had been a hard winter. This year, nothing. She didn't have the heart to mention it to the kids. It didn't matter, she thought, as she made the breakfast herself. But then the car wouldn't start and she didn't know what to do, and this made her miss Patrick more than ever. He was good with practical things. He would have figured something out. "Can we go in Dad's van instead?" Gabe had piped up hopefully. But there wasn't room for them all in there. And besides, Zoe had never liked driving it. "Do we have to go?" moaned Ethan, kicking at the tyres of the useless car. "Yes, it's Grandma's special birthday, and she's booked us all in for a nice lunch at the pub," Zoe snapped, just as it started to drizzle. "We'll get the bus." Once at the pub, she felt herself unwind a little. Liz gave her a hug and made a fuss of the children, and even Derek tried his best, producing a 50p coin and doing tricks for Bea. She didn't have to cook, Zoe consoled herself. She'd washed her hair that morning and put on some lipstick and a nice top for the first time in weeks, and felt a shade more human again as a result. The children were on good form too, with Gabe in particular making everyone laugh with his impressions and general daftness. For a short while she was able to keep the sadness at bay and relax, enjoy the food and company, even smile a few times. Who knew, she thought, hugging her in-laws goodbye when it was time to leave, that small pleasures could make such a big difference. Best of all, Dan offered them a lift home, which was a relief to everyone after the bad-tempered bus journey over there. Then, back at the house, he poked around under the bonnet of her car for a while, before coming in to tell her that he was fairly certain it was a flat battery. Under his instruction, they managed to jump-start the engine. Then he suggested that Zoe drive around for 15 minutes or so to give it a decent charge. "Call this your Mother's Day treat," he said with a faint smile. 15 minutes peace on a Sunday. Hell, go out for longer if you want. Put some music on. I'll hold the fort till you get back again. "Don't tempt me," she said, before grudgingly admitting to herself that she was grateful to him. "Thanks," she added. "I appreciate this." "No problem," he replied, putting up a hand in farewell as she edged out of the drive. It was quite a novelty to Zoe, driving aimlessly around with nowhere in particular to go. Usually sitting at the wheel meant a chore, either going to whichever school she was working in that week, a trip to the supermarket, or ferrying the kids to an activity or birthday party, one eye on the clock, worrying about being late and, more often than not, trying to referee a bout of bickering and jostling that was kicking off on the back seat, without losing her focus on the road. None of that today. Complete silence and no distractions. Once she'd recovered from her initial nervousness that the car would give out on her, it was almost a relaxing experience. She turned on the radio and found some upbeat dance music, then whacked the volume up high. Hell, it was Mother's Day, and nobody was around to criticise her singing. Forget Dr. Gupta's advice about lavender baths and talking therapy. It turned out that belting out a great pop song felt better than anything, really cathartic. Right until a cheesy love ballad came on, and she found that tears were rolling down her face anyway. She arrived back eventually to find Gabe glued to the Xbox. She really needed to start enforcing stricter rules about that. And Dan taking part in one of Bee's tea parties, along with various teddies and stuffed toys that had been arranged in a circle. Ethan, hopefully, was upstairs doing homework, although the chances were he was plugged into a game too. Oh well, she wasn't going to start picking fights today. "All okay?" Dan asked, setting his miniature floral teacup down on its mismatched red plastic saucer with comedic daintiness. "All good," she replied. "Thanks again. Can I make you a coffee or something?" "I've just made him one, actually, Mummy," Bee protested. Dan pretended to drain the empty teacup, smacking his lips for good measure afterwards. "Delicious," he assured Bee. "Another coffee would be great," he replied to Zoe, getting up. "Thanks, Bee. That was exactly what I needed." They went into the kitchen and then something very weird happened. When Dan went to get the milk out of the fridge, he stopped dead in front of it, peered closer at something, then said in a strangled voice, "Wait. So you know her? This Lydia Fox?" "What?" Zoe was confused for a moment, until she saw he was pointing at a business card pinned up there with a San Francisco tram magnet, and she realised it was the one given to her by the nice woman in the gift shop earlier that week. "Oh, no, not really. It's just some woman I met in a shop." "You met her in a shop?" For some reason, Dan looked completely taken aback. She'd go as far as to say stricken, even. Was there some law that had been passed about talking to strangers in shops, or what? Why was he acting so peculiarly? Recently, or... Yeah, a few days ago. Why? What, she came up to you and... Is she following you or something? Zoe stared at him, unable to see where this was going, or indeed where it had come from. "No, I just... Why?" she repeated. "Do you know her then?" Before he could reply, they both heard the front door slam and Ethan's voice. "Gabe! Bee! Come here!" Startled, Zoe swung round. "Where's he been?" she asked, feeling as if she had lost track of her senses. She could have sworn she'd only been out for 20 minutes, yet she seemed to have returned to a parallel universe where nothing felt quite normal. Just out," Dan replied vaguely. In the next moment, Ethan, Gabe and Bee marched into the kitchen together, Ethan holding a bunch of daffodils, Gabe clutching a box of milk tray, and Bee brandishing her most beloved pink stuffed unicorn. "Happy Mother's Day!" they chorused, all three of them beaming at their own cunning. "You can keep my unicorn if you really want," Bee added lavishly, before appearing to regret such impulsive generosity. For today, I mean. Zoe actually felt quite tearful for a moment as she crouched down so that they could rush into her arms. The daffs were dripping on one shoulder, a corner of the chocolate box jabbed painfully into her boob, and Bea, scrambling to get on her lap, almost knocked her over. But it was a good moment. A really good moment. My favourite flowers, my favourite chocolates, and most definitely my favourite children, she said into their necks, as love spread through her like a balm. It was only much later on that evening that she remembered Dan's strange behaviour with the shopwoman's business card, and wondered what that had all been about. Probably nothing, she decided, stuffing a chocolate fudge into her mouth. She wouldn't waste time dwelling on it, when the worst had already happened. From now on, the only way was up. Chapter 8. Lydia was dishing up platefuls of disappointingly stodgy macaroni cheese when her phone started ringing. It was Monday tea time, and when she glanced over and saw a number she didn't recognise on screen, she decided to ignore it. No doubt it would be some scammy call about a non-existent injury claim that she was supposed to have made, or the phone company trying to talk her into an expensive upgrade. No thanks. Besides, the peas were about to boil over if she didn't attend to them this second. "Tea's ready," she yelled through to Jemima, who had been practicing forward rolls up and down the living room for the last 20 minutes. "Bugger off," she muttered, as the phone began ringing a second time. Jemima burst in, her bunches loose and wonky after her gymnastics, navy blue school socks in wrinkles around her ankles. "Oh, I forgot to say, Mum," she began, hopping from one foot to the other. "Guess what? Miss Sargent's getting married in June. To a lady." "How nice," Lydia said, pouring a glass of milk for her daughter and putting it on the table. Miss Sargent was Jemima's kind, clever class teacher and the current object of hero worship. The much-adored Miss Sargent had been invited to Jemima's birthday party back in January. "Please don't feel you have to come," Lydia had whispered to her, taking her aside at pick-up time the day invitations came out. At all. She had been the recipient of a very special Christmas card that had been laboured over for an entire weekend, and she also starred as the subject of countless anecdotes, observations and drawings. Lydia was pleased that her daughter had a great role model. It was a step up from Barbie, she supposed, but had been slightly taken aback by Jemima's breathless, unending enthusiasm for the woman. She hoped she hadn't raised some kind of stalker in the making, put it that way. "I want to get married to a girl too when I'm big. I just like them more than boys. Hey, Mum, idea. Why don't you get married to a lady?" Jemima said, dragging the stool over to the sink so that she could wash her hands. "Then you won't be lonely." "I'm not lonely, darling," Lydia said, spooning carrots and peas onto their plates and trying not to leap on the defensive. "You are a bit lonely," her daughter insisted. "I heard you telling Bridget once, and you don't have anyone to talk to when I go to bed. Maybe I should stay up late with you tonight." Ever the optimist, always ready to try her luck. That was her girl. "That's kind, but I'm fine, thanks," Lydia assured her, trying not to laugh. "Besides, you need your sleep after all that gym. Remember you were saying you wanted to be as tall as Poppy at school? Well, you grow when you're asleep. So, the earlier you go to bed..." "I'll get taller and taller and taller." Jemima hopped down and shook her hands, soapy water flecking her school skirt where she hadn't rinsed off the suds. "But you could marry a lady, if you don't like men." Tenacity was her daughter's middle name. Well, it wasn't, obviously, but maybe it should have been. Who said I didn't like men? Lydia replied mildly. Give those hands a proper dry, please. You said you didn't. You said to Bridget, I hate beep men. Jemima gave her the side-eye before sliding into her seat at the table. The beep was a rude word, by the way, she added, with uncharacteristic primness, and I heard it. I don't know what Miss Sargent would say if she knew I had heard words like that from my mum. Sorry. Lydia put their plates on the table, then cupped her hands around her mouth and pretended to shout out of the window. Sorry, Miss Sargent, it won't happen again, I promise. She pulled a funny face at Jemima and decided it was time to move the conversation along now. So, tell me more about what happened on the trampoline anyway. Did you say you were learning a new routine? Yeah, but... Jemima waved her fork, unwilling to be distracted from the more important matter at hand. You could marry Bridget, she persisted. Why don't you? Lydia tried not to sigh as she dug into the macaroni. I'm happy with things as they are, she said. Just the two of us. I thought you were too. In fact, I remember you saying, if you married Bridget, we could live in her house, though, and I could share Rowan's bedroom. Can I? Darling, this was getting out of hand. To marry someone, you have to be in love with them, okay? You have to really, really like them. But you do like and feel like kissing them all the time. You and Bridget hug each other. I've seen you. Yes, but it's different. She's my friend. I'm not madly in love with her. I don't want to kiss her. Jemima pouted. That's not very kind. Poor Bridget. She probably doesn't want me to kiss her, Lydia pointed out. Anyway, I'm glad Miss Sargent is getting married. Did she tell you anything about the wedding? Not really. Jemima looked thoughtful for a moment as she speared a carrot and swished it through some cheese sauce. Mum, can I tell you a secret? A really, really big secret that you're not allowed to tell anyone. Of course. Anything. You're not getting married as well, are you? No, Mum, don't be so silly. The secret is... Jemima looked around theatrically, as if double-checking they were alone for this revelation, then lowered her voice. Clearly it was a matter of extreme importance. The secret is... I'm going to ask Miss Sargent if I can be her bridesmaid, and I think she will say yes. Later that evening, not long after Jemima had gone to bed, Lydia's phone started ringing again. The same number as before, she saw. This had better be good, she grumbled, flicking a finger across the screen to answer the call. Hello? Hi. It was a man. A hesitant man by the sound of the pause that followed. Is that Lydia Fox? A sales call, she guessed. Yes, she said, still on her guard. Who's calling? I think you knew my brother, said the man. Patrick Shepherd? Lydia frowned. Patrick Shepherd, she repeated to herself, racking her brain but drawing a complete blank. Never heard of him, she said. Really, said the man. Was that sarcasm in his voice? Well, he's been paying you money every month for 7 years. Paying money for... Lydia's hands felt clammy all of a sudden as the penny dropped. You mean Patrick Armstrong? She said shakily. Shit. What was this about? No, I don't mean Patrick Armstrong, I mean Patrick Shepherd, came the testy response. Look, I don't know what your game is, but leave my sister-in-law out of it, all right? If you're thinking of harassing her or... What? Lydia couldn't follow the conversation any longer. None of it was making sense. Whoa, hold on a minute. What are you talking about? I'm not harassing anyone. And the only Patrick I used to know was called Patrick Armstrong. Or at least that's what he told me, she said with rather less conviction, as cogs began clicking and turning in her brain. After their split, Patrick seemed to vanish off the face of the earth. The maintenance money he'd paid her every month appeared on her bank statements as coming from PS Holdings Limited. But when she looked up the company to try and get an address, she found that it was registered to an accountant's office. An accountant who refused to give her any further information about the company. PS Holdings, she repeated to herself now. PS for Patrick Shepherd, maybe? Her head was whirling. I've no idea who your sister-in-law is, she added. Well, she had your phone number on her fridge door, so that's obviously not true, the man said. He actually sounded aggressive now, as if he was angry with her. For doing what? Existing, she thought crossly. Having fallen in love 8 years ago. And what was all this rubbish about a fridge door anyway? Maybe he was some random weirdo. I think you've got the wrong number, she said. Bye now. Wait, he said, just as she was about to hang up. And despite the strangeness of this conversation so far, something gave her pause. This man knew about the maintenance money after all. If he really was Patrick's brother, her Patrick, then what was his reason for getting in touch after so long? Sorry, he said. Let me start from the beginning. I've been helping with Patrick's accounts, and I'm ringing up about a monthly payment that goes out to you. Back to the payments again, then. Something inside Lydia crumpled. Oh no. She hoped this wasn't heading where she thought it might be. Was Patrick trying to get out of paying her any more? Right, she said warily, her heart stepping up a gear. She tucked her legs underneath her on the sofa, then changed her mind and swung them down, stood up in the middle of the room and dug her toes into the soft rug, as if anchoring herself. Here we go. And forgive me for asking, but I'm trying to work out, your relationship to Patrick. Lydia pulled a face even though there was nobody there to see her. Her relationship with Patrick. There hadn't been one since he had ditched her, then disappeared from her life. So why don't you ask him that? She replied after a moment. There was an awkward pause. He's not here right now, the man said. Look, could we meet up, maybe? It might be easier to talk about this in person. Talk about what? This isn't some kind of trick, is it? Has he put you up to this? She remembered the date all of a sudden and groaned. April Fool's Day. Very funny. Hilarious. Who are you, really? Did Bridget give you my number? No, he replied. It's not a trick or anything like that. I swear. There was a pause, then he said, Look, I know this is all a bit out of the blue, but can we meet? Is he going to be there? Is that what this is about? Lydia asked. She was starting to feel nervous. If this was some long-winded preamble to Patrick telling her he wasn't going to pay her child maintenance anymore, then he could think again, because she would find a solicitor and take him to court. Her career had come to an abrupt halt after Jemima had been born. The unsociable hours didn't work with a baby to factor in, plus the cost of childcare was only marginally less than her salary. She'd been a stay-at-home mum for 5 years, the two of them forced to live in her dad's spare room for the first year because she was so skint, only getting some part-time shop work from her godfather once Jemima was old enough to go to school. She needed the money from Patrick, that was the point. She relied very heavily on his monthly contribution to their daughter's upkeep. "No, it'll just be me," the man said. "When are you free this week?" She didn't like the sound of this. She didn't like the sound of it at all. She felt very much as if she might be walking into a trap. But all the same, she was intrigued at the thought of Patrick coming back into her life. "I finish work at 1 tomorrow," she found herself saying. "I could meet you in Gunnersbury Park Cafe at about past." "Okay," he said. How will we recognise each other?" "I've got a red Mac," she said, wrinkling her nose at how weird this was. At least if they met in the cafe there would be other people around, she thought, in case he turned out to be a complete nutter. And she'd have her bike with her, so if the worst came to the worst, she could just hop on it and pedal away, fast. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. And that was that. Hanging up, she slumped back into the sofa, pulling a plum-coloured velvety cushion across her middle and hugging it for comfort. She had no idea what to make of the man's strange accusations, harassment, and his guardedness about Patrick. She hoped she wasn't getting involved in something unpleasant. Still frowning, she texted her best friend Bridget with the number that he'd called her on. "Bit random, but if by any chance I am not at school pick-up tomorrow, I have gone to meet the person who has this number. Please pass it on to the police if I am found dead in a bin bag a few weeks later." Bridget phoned approximately 2 seconds after the message had been sent. "What? Are you going on a date or something? What's his name? Tell me everything." Lydia felt herself collapse a bit inside, because this was probably going to be the exact opposite of a date. "I don't know his name," she confessed miserably, still clutching the soft cushion. He hadn't mentioned it, and in her fluster she hadn't thought to ask. "It's not what you think, though. I'll tell you more when I see you, but I don't have a good feeling about this." "Can I help? Do you need moral support? An angry kickboxing friend beside you?" Came Bridget's next questions, and Lydia smiled weakly, before remembering the conversation she'd had with Jemima over dinner. "No, but thank you. By the way, just so you know, my daughter would like us to get married, and to be honest, I'm finding it hard to think of a reason why not right now," she said, and they both laughed. "Thanks, Bridge. Sorry to go all dramatic on you. It's probably nothing, but, well, I'll find out. Coffee on Thursday?" "You bet, and they're on me, with brownies too," Bridget replied. She seemed reluctant to go. "Call me if you need me, won't you?" "Thanks, I will." Patrick Armstrong, or Shepherd, she supposed, had burst into Lydia's life like an unexpected firework, dazzling and beautiful, but over too soon. She had fallen for him so hard, so absolutely, it was as if her feet left the ground whenever they spoke. It had been a good time in her life, full stop really. She was living in a shared house with Bridget and 2 other friends, and worked as an events organiser at an art space in Richmond. Life was one long whirl of fun. She loved her job and her friends, She was busy all the time and making the most of being young and single. And then one evening, introducing the first act at the Arts Centre's monthly open mic comedy night, she caught Patrick's eye amidst the audience, and the world started to spin even faster. Oh, sure, she'd had boyfriends before, but with Patrick everything was different. She felt different for a start, free and uncontained, and he was a million miles away from previous loser boyfriends who'd all been either emotionally stunted or hopelessly unfaithful. Patrick was a proper man, 10 years older than her, confident, clever and handsome. He treated Lydia like a princess, taking her to gorgeous quiet restaurants and boutique hotels and art house cinemas. Her housemates all developed crushes on him too, when he stayed over the first time and made everyone poached eggs for breakfast the following morning. Who wouldn't fall in love with a man like that? The only problem with a firework relationship was that once it had shot up unfeasibly high, bright and sparkling, it was fated to fall just as quickly back to earth again, scorched and extinguished, dead. And whatever future Lydia thought the two of them might have shared together, her dreams were immediately shattered when 5 months in she discovered she was accidentally pregnant. They were in the White Swan on a warm May evening when she broke the news, sitting out at a table by the river, and fool that she was, she'd been nursing a secret wild hope, ever since seeing the test result, that Patrick would take her hands and express his joy. "It's all a bit of a rush," she imagined him saying, "but we can make it work, right? You're the one. This is meant to be." Instead, he could hardly wait to get away, and out it had all come, the harsh blurted truth about a wife and children, delivered in scant sentences like a series of gut punches. "I've been meaning to tell you," he said, his eyes sliding away from hers just to underline the lie. "Let me give you some money to take care of things." It all added up then, too late. Why he only ever came to her place. Why he preferred those quiet, tucked-away restaurants and hotels on the outskirts of the city. How he'd never really said much about his family and wasn't on social media. A fling, he'd called their relationship, when in her mind it had been true love, or at least heading in that direction. In hindsight, she'd been so dazzled by his brightness that she hadn't looked closely at all the small print. And okay, so they had only been seeing each other for a short while, but their split knocked the wind out of her sails so thoroughly that she'd never really recovered. Angry to have been conned, heartbroken that she'd never see him again, she had entertained thoughts of revenge, of wrecking his life just as he'd ruined hers. But either he'd given her a false surname or he'd vanished from London, because he seemed impossible to track down, both online or through the electoral register. She had his phone number and that was it, she realised belatedly. He had kept her like a dog on a lead, and she'd been only too keen to trot along devotedly after him, willing to give him all the power. Pride kept her from contacting him again, plus the few shreds she had left of her dignity. And maybe, if she hadn't been pregnant, she would have carried on with her life and bounced back from the disappointment there and then. Everything would have been simpler. She could have stayed in her job and her house. She would have met somebody else and written Patrick off as a warning to keep her wits about her, and not go diving in head first thinking you were in love. Instead, she had been plunged into the quandary of what to do. If only her mum had been around to lean on, to ask. It had been the hardest, loneliest decision of her life. Then, once Frank, her dad, had finished threatening to track down Patrick and knock his block off, he'd said gruffly, "You know, Liddy, you were a surprise to me and your mum. You weren't planned, and you turned out to be the best thing ever for us. The most wonderful surprise." Perhaps, looking back, It had been silly of her to make such a massive decision swayed by sentiment. But it was the thought of her mum undergoing a similar dilemma and choosing to say yes to the baby, yes to Lydia's life, that clinched it in the end. Maybe it was the hormones as well, buoying her with optimism. Whatever, she had said yes to. Yes to single motherhood and all that it entailed. As far as Patrick was concerned, she had at first ruled him out of the equation. She didn't need him. Until after Jemima's birth, when her dad encouraged her to get back in touch. He's the child's father and he has a responsibility, like it or not, Frank had said. Whatever your feelings about him now, Jemima won't thank you for it later if you don't at least try. You have to contact the man, Liddy, and that's that. He had a point. So Lydia had rather grudgingly sent Patrick a text message, along with a picture of Jemima. Here is our daughter, she told him. We would both love you to be a part of our lives, whether that's in person or merely financially. Yes, if she was honest, she had felt a faint flicker of hope that he might change his mind when he saw their baby girl. Because, come on, she was beautiful, and it was such a cute picture of her round pink face, her rosebud lips pouting as she slept, those ridiculously long eyelashes. But Patrick rang up the same day and sounded terse, not clucky and admiring at all. Is that some kind of threat? He began the call, before setting out his terms cold and clinical. It was best if he didn't see the baby. He actually called her that. The baby. As if Lydia hadn't just told him her name, as if Jemima wasn't his own flesh and blood. But he would contribute towards her upkeep every month, providing Lydia stayed away. If she ever tried to mess up his family life, he would stop the payments immediately. Was that clear? By now, of course, any hope had been completely snuffed out, and whatever love she'd once felt had curdled to hurt and then to hatred. She loathed Patrick for responding with such unfeeling curtness, for laying out such horrible, mean-spirited parameters. If she'd been wealthier herself, she would have told him where to shove his payments. But she was not wealthy, so she was trapped in a corner, unable to do anything other than agree. Yes, it was clear. Yes, she understood. And so began their silent monthly transaction of Patrick paying Lydia to keep them both out of his life. She had absorbed the sting of his double rejection and tried to remove him from her head. Successfully, mostly, as motherhood kept her busy and distracted. As Jemima changed from a baby to a toddler to a little girl, and Lydia held it together, made things work. They had managed this far anyway, and she was proud of herself. But now her life was in danger of being stirred up all over again. Patrick, via this brother of his, was back in touch, and she couldn't help nervously remembering the terms of their agreement. How the payments would stop if she broke his stupid rules. Had she unwittingly let something slip? Jemima had asked questions now and then, but Lydia had never once blown Patrick's cover or intruded on his life. She didn't think she had anyway. So why was he on her case now? What had changed? Oh, God. She was dreading this meeting. She knew already she wouldn't sleep well tonight. Patrick Shepherd, she thought to herself, glancing back at her phone and realising that she could go foraging for more information about him, now that she knew his real name at last. It was like being handed the key to unlock a mystery. She could type his name into the search bar and go digging, gorge on pictures of his wife and children, see what else she could find. Sometimes you could know too much, though. Sometimes this sort of knowledge hurt. Did she really want to torture herself by poring over the details of his life without her? Her hand hovered over the phone, and then she snatched it away. No, she thought. She had come this far. She could live without knowing a little while longer, thank you very much. She would deal with whatever new twist or turn was coming her way tomorrow. She glanced across at Jemima's Year 2 school photograph on the bookcase nearby, taking in the dearly loved dimple face that was half Lydia, half Patrick, with a pinch of pure Jemima for good measure, and felt a twist of fear inside. Whatever this was about, she just hoped she could handle it.
This is the end of CD3. The book continues on CD4.